There's no pain like a father losing his child, especially when you never find the body or learn what happened. Miguel Santos lived this nightmare when his son Carlos and two friends vanished into the jungle 6 years ago, chasing stories of a magical wishing well. The search teams found nothing. No footprints, no clothes, no trace. The village blamed the cursed jungle that had claimed others before. Miguel never stopped searching, even when people called him crazy for saying he heard Carlos calling from the trees. Then yesterday, a thin teenager walked out of that same jungle. It was Carlos, 6 years older and barely alive. He won't talk about what happened or where the other boys are. But when he finally speaks, his story about the stone well and the terrible choice he made will change everything. What happened to the other 2 boys? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dirt streets of San Marcos, a village so small it barely warranted a dot on most maps. Here, where electricity arrived sporadically and running water remained a luxury for the fortunate few, Miguel Santos had spent 43 years learning that life offered more sorrow than joy. His calloused hands, weathered from decades of manual labor, trembled as he clutched the wooden prayer beads his late wife Maria had pressed into his palm during her final moments 8 years ago. These beads had become his anchor, worn smooth by countless hours of desperate prayer. Each morning, he would sit on the cracked wooden steps of his small adobe house, working the beads between his fingers while watching the jungle's edge for any sign, any miracle that might bring his boy home. The house itself told the story of a man whose world had crumbled in stages, paint peeled from walls that had once echoed with laughter. The kitchen table, carved by Miguel's own father, sat too large for one person, yet too small for the family that should have filled it. Photographs lined the windowsill, Maria in her wedding dress, the boys at various ages. Carlos's gap-toothed grin frozen in time at age 12. 6 years ago, Carlos had been inseparable from his 2 best friends, Luis Morales and Javier Ruiz. The 3 boys moved through the village like a single unit, sharing dreams that seemed impossibly large for such a small place. Luis, the thoughtful one with gentle eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, often spoke of becoming a teacher like his mother Elena. Javier, stocky and perpetually optimistic, insisted he would one day own a fleet of trucks to carry goods between villages. But Carlos, Miguel's only child, carried the heaviest burden of all, the desperate wish to lift his father from poverty. "Papa, when I'm older I'll build you a real house," Carlos would say, his young voice filled with determination. "With electricity and hot water, and you'll never have to work in the fields again." Miguel had always smiled at such declarations, ruffling his son's dark hair while privately aching at the boy's premature concern for adult responsibilities. At 12, Carlos should have worried about soccer games and school tests, not his father's empty pockets or the holes in their roof that leaked during the rainy season. The legend of the stone well had existed in San Marcos longer than anyone could remember. Village elders spoke of it in whispers, usually after too much mezcal had loosened their tongues. Deep in the jungle, they claimed, stood an ancient well carved from black stone, older than the Spanish conquest, older than memory itself. Those brave or foolish enough to find it could make a single wish, but the price, they warned, was never what it seemed. Most adults dismiss such tales as folklore, designed to keep children from wandering too far into the jungle's dangerous depths. The forest had claimed enough lives over the decades, hunters who never returned, women gathering herbs who vanished without trace, children who ignored their parents' warnings about straying beyond the village boundaries. But children, as children do, heard different messages in such stories. Where adults heard warnings, the boys heard possibility. Where elders spoke of danger, they heard adventure. And when you're 12 years old, watching your father work himself to exhaustion for wages that barely bought rice and beans, a magical wishing well doesn't sound like folklore. It sounds like hope. Dr. Carmen Vasquez had been the village's only medical practitioner for 15 years, arriving fresh from medical school in Mexico City with idealistic dreams of serving the poor. Time had tempered her idealism but not her compassion. She had delivered Carlos into the world 13 years ago, had treated his childhood illnesses, had watched him grow from a serious baby into a boy who carried the weight of his family's struggles on shoulders. Too young for such burdens, when the three boys disappeared. On that October morning 6 years ago, Dr. Vasquez had joined the search parties that combed every accessible inch of jungle. She had seen Miguel's gradual descent from grief into something approaching madness as months passed without answers. She had been the one to gently suggest that perhaps it was time to accept the unthinkable. Miguel, she had said during one of his rare visits to treat cuts and insect bites from his jungle expeditions, sometimes loving someone means letting them go. But Miguel had looked at her with eyes that held depths of pain she couldn't fathom. "Would you let go, doctor? If it were your child?" She had no children of her own, no answer that wouldn't sound hollow. So she simply cleaned his wounds and watched him disappear back into the green maze that had swallowed his world. Father Rodriguez, the village priest, had arrived in San Marcos 2 years after the boy's disappearance. He inherited not only a small congregation, but also Miguel's complicated relationship with faith. The man attended Mass sporadically, usually sitting in the back pew with his prayer beads, lips moving in silent conversation with a God who seemed to have stopped listening. Faith isn't about understanding God's plan, Father Rodriguez would tell Miguel during their careful conversations. Sometimes faith is simply about enduring. But endurance, Miguel had learned, could drive a man to the edges of sanity. He developed routines that the villagers began to recognize as symptoms of his obsession. Every dawn found him at the jungle's edge, calling his son's name into the green silence. He carved Carlos's initials into tree trunks, as if marking territory in a war against time itself. He learned to read the forest's moods, to recognize the calls of birds and the patterns of rain that might reveal secrets the search parties had missed. The villagers' patience evolved through predictable stages. First came sympathy, meals left on his doorstep and offers of help he rarely accepted. Then came concern as his behavior grew more erratic. Finally came resignation, the kind reserved for tragedies that refused to resolve themselves neatly. They stopped asking about his searches, stopped offering comfort he wouldn't accept, stopped believing he might ever find peace. But Miguel never stopped believing. Even as his hair grew gray and his body bent under the weight of endless grief, even as neighbors began crossing themselves when they saw him talking to empty air, he maintained an unshakable conviction that his son lived somewhere in that vast green maze. Yesterday morning had started like any other. Miguel had risen before dawn, wrapped his prayer beads around his wrist, and walked to the jungle's edge. The October air carried the same dampness, the same symphony of insects and birds that had greeted him every morning for 6 years. He had called Carlos's name into the forest, as he always did, expecting only echoes in return. Instead, something answered, not a voice exactly, but a sound, a rustling in the underbrush that carried a rhythm too purposeful to be wind or animals. Miguel had frozen, hardly daring to breathe as the sound grew closer. Branches parted, leaves whispered aside, and a figure emerged from the green shadows. The boy who stumbled into the morning light bore only passing resemblance to the 12-year-old who had vanished 6 years earlier. This teenager's frame stretched tall and painfully thin, his clothes hanging in tatters that might once have been the jeans and t-shirt Carlos had worn that last October morning. His hair hung past his shoulders, matted with leaves and dirt. But his eyes, those dark eyes that had inherited Maria's gentle wisdom, those eyes Miguel would recognize anywhere. Carlos had aged 6 years in 6 years, but something in his gaze suggested he had lived far more than time should have allowed. He moved like an old man, carefully placing each step as if the earth itself might betray him. When he looked at his father, recognition flickered behind a wall of caution that broke Miguel's heart almost as thoroughly as the boy's absence had. "Carlos?" Miguel had whispered, afraid that speaking too loudly might shatter the moment like a fragile dream. The boy, his boy, had nodded once before collapsing into his father's arms. Dr. Vasquez had arrived within minutes of Miguel's shouted summons. She found father and son on the dirt floor of their small kitchen, Miguel cradling Carlos against his chest while tears carved clean tracks through years of accumulated grief on his weathered face. Malnourished, but stable, had been her initial assessment. After a hurried examination, dehydrated, exhausted, but alive. Remarkably, impossibly alive. The physical examination revealed mysteries that deepened rather than resolved questions. Carlos bore no serious injuries, no broken bones or infected wounds that might explain 6 years of absence. His body showed signs of long-term malnutrition, but not starvation. His skin carried unusual scars, thin white lines that formed patterns too deliberate to be accidental, too precise to be explained by jungle survival. Most disturbing were his hands. The palms bore calluses unlike any Dr. Vasquez had seen, raised and hardened in ways that suggested regular contact with stone rather than wood or metal. When she asked about them, Carlos had simply stared at his palms, as if seeing them for the first time. Word of Carlos's return spread through San Marcos with the speed that only small villages can achieve. By afternoon, neighbors had gathered in Miguel's small yard, their faces displaying the careful mixture of joy and unease that accompanies miracles. Children who had grown up hearing whispered stories about the lost boys now saw living proof that sometimes the impossible becomes real. But Carlos himself remained silent, his eyes holding depths that seemed far older than his 19 years should contain. When Elena Morales arrived, Luis's mother, her face carved by 6 years of grief that matched Miguel's own, Carlos had looked at her with something approaching guilt before turning away. "Where is my Luis?" she had asked, her voice carrying the kind of hope that dares not hope too much. "Where are the other boys?" Carlos had closed his eyes, his entire body seeming to fold inward. When he finally looked at Elena again, his expression held an apology that made her step backward as if physically struck. "They're still there," he whispered, his first words since returning home. "They're still in the jungle." The silence that followed those words seemed to stretch beyond the boundaries of Miguel's small yard, reaching into the forest itself as if the trees were holding their breath. Elena's face cycled through emotions, hope, confusion, dawning horror, before settling into the mask of determination that only a mother's love can create. "Then we go get them," she said simply, but Carlos shook his head, and in that gesture lay the beginning of a truth that would transform everything they thought they knew about the jungle, the legend and the price of wishes granted in darkness. As evening approached and the neighbors gradually dispersed, Miguel sat beside his son on the same wooden steps where he had spent 6 years praying for this moment. Carlos remained silent, his gaze fixed on the jungle's edge as if expecting something to emerge from the shadows. Miguel worked his prayer beads between his fingers, the worn wood smooth as river stones. These beads had carried him through Maria's death, through Carlos's disappearance, through 6 years of searching and hope and despair. Now, with his son miraculously returned, he found himself afraid to pray for anything more. But Elena's son remained lost in that green maze. Javier's family still waited for news, and Carlos's silence suggested that their story was far from over. The jungle stretched beyond the village boundaries, vast and patient and full of secrets that daylight couldn't penetrate. Somewhere in those depths lay answers that Carlos carried like wounds. Tomorrow would bring questions that demanded responses, decisions that couldn't be delayed by exhaustion or shock, or the simple desire to hold on to miracles without examining their cost. For tonight, though Miguel allowed himself the fierce joy of his son's breathing beside him, the solid weight of Carlos's presence that made the worn prayer beads feel like instruments of thanksgiving rather than desperate supplication. Whatever truths tomorrow might reveal, whatever prices might yet need paying, This moment existed beyond the reach of time or sorrow or the darkness that dwelt beneath the jungle's canopy. The stone well and its ancient guardian could wait. Father and son had found each other again, and for now, that was miracle enough to sustain them through whatever revelations dawn might bring. Dr. Vasquez arrived at Miguel's house before dawn, her medical bag weighing heavy in her hand. She had barely slept, her mind cycling through the impossibility of Carlos's return and the medical anomalies she couldn't explain. The boy's scars, those peculiar calluses, the way his eyes seemed to hold knowledge that belonged to someone far older, none of it fit any pattern she understood from 15 years of practice. Carlos sat at the kitchen table, staring at a bowl of rice and beans he hadn't touched. Miguel hovered nearby, afraid to leave his son's side even for a moment, as if Carlos might dissolve back into the jungle like morning mist. The morning light streaming through the window revealed details that darkness had hidden. The boy's skin held an unusual pallor, as if he hadn't seen proper sunlight in years, and his fingers traced patterns on the wooden table surface with unconscious precision. "Carlos," Dr. Vasquez said gently, settling into the chair across from him. "I know yesterday was overwhelming, but we need to understand what happened. Where have you been for 6 years?" The boy's hands stilled on the table. For a long moment, the only sounds were the distant calls of roosters and the soft whisper of wind through the thatched roof. When Carlos finally looked up, his eyes held a weight that made both adults take an involuntary step back. "We found it," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The stone well. It's real." Miguel's prayer beads slipped from his fingers, clattering to the floor. He had spent 6 years searching every accessible path, following every trail, marking trees and mapping routes with the obsessive thoroughness of a man whose sanity depended on methodical action. In all that time, he had never found anything resembling the legendary well. "Where?" Miguel asked, his voice rough with emotion. "Show me where!" But Carlos shook his head, his entire body beginning to tremble. "You can't go there, Papa. Nobody can go there." "It's not—" He stopped, his hands gripping the table edge until his knuckles went white. "The well isn't what the stories say. It doesn't grant wishes. It takes things. It makes trades." Dr. Vasquez leaned forward, her medical training warring with the impossibility of what she was hearing. "What kind of trades, Carlos?" The boy's gaze darted between his father and the doctor, as if measuring how much truth they could bear. The jungle map Miguel had created over 6 years of searching lay spread across the kitchen counter, every trail marked, every dead end noted, every hope and disappointment recorded in pencil and ink. Carlos's eyes fixed on that map with something approaching horror. "We went deeper than anyone had gone before," Carlos began, his voice taking on the rhythm of a confession. Luis had found references to the well in his mother's old books, descriptions from Spanish missionaries who wrote about indigenous legends. Javier brought rope and supplies he'd stolen from his father's construction site. And he touched his chest where his shirt hung open, revealing a thin scar that ran directly over his heart. "I brought Papa's old compass." Miguel recognized the compass Carlos described, a brass instrument that had belonged to Miguel's father. A tool that had guided 3 generations through journeys both literal and metaphorical. He had assumed it lost in the house fire that claimed several of their possessions 2 years after Carlos's disappearance. "The compass led us to places that shouldn't exist," Carlos continued, his voice growing stronger as the words began pouring out. "Paths that weren't there the day before, clearings that appeared when we needed them most. The deeper we went, the more the jungle seemed to change around us. Trees grew thicker, older, and the sounds—" He paused, listening to something only he could hear. The sounds were wrong. No birds, no insects, just whispers in a language none of us understood. Dr. Vasquez found herself taking notes, her medical mind trying to categorize what she was hearing as trauma response. Hallucination or something her training had never prepared her to understand. But Carlos's description carried the vivid detail of lived experience, the kind of specific memory that couldn't be fabricated or dreamed. "We found the clearing on our 3rd day of walking," Carlos said. The well stood in the center, carved from black stone that seemed to absorb light. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, patterns that made your eyes water and your head ache. But we could feel it calling to us, promising answers to every prayer we'd ever whispered. Miguel's hands shook as he retrieved his fallen prayer beads. These same beads had accompanied countless desperate prayers for his son's return, for guidance, for some sign that Carlos lived somewhere beyond the jungle's green curtain. To learn that those prayers might have been answered by something ancient and alien filled him with a terror that ran deeper than 6 years of grief. "What happened when you looked into the well?" Dr. Vasquez asked. Though part of her dreaded the answer, Carlos's face went ashen. "We saw our wishes reflected in the water. Luis saw himself teaching in a real school with books and supplies and students who wanted to learn. Javier saw his family wealthy beyond their dreams, his father's debts erased, his sisters educated in the capital. And I," his voice broke, "I saw you, Papa, in a house with electricity and running water, your hands soft because you never had to work in the fields again. I saw Mama, alive and healthy, cooking in a kitchen that smelled like her perfume instead of poverty." The silence that followed was profound. Miguel felt his world tilting on its axis as he understood that his son's disappearance had been motivated by love, a 12-year-old's desperate desire to fix everything wrong in his father's life. The prayer beads in his hands seemed to pulse with their own heartbeat, each worn wooden sphere containing years of wishes that had perhaps been heard by something that should have remained sleeping. "But the well demanded payment," Carlos whispered. "Not money or possessions. It wanted service, time, lives dedicated to feeding its hunger." "What kind of hunger?" Dr. Vasquez asked, though her medical rationality was rapidly giving way to something approaching belief in the impossible. "It feeds on hope," Carlos said, his eyes now fixed on some point beyond the kitchen walls. "The deeper the hope, the stronger the desperation, the more it hungers." And we were 3 boys full of hope, standing at the edge of a well that promised everything we'd ever dreamed of achieving. Miguel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The jungle map on his counter suddenly seemed less like documentation of his search efforts, and more like a record of his own gradual surrender to the same forces that had claimed his son. Every marked trail, every notation of progress or failure, every modification based on dreams or hunches, all of it had been leading him deeper into patterns he was only beginning to understand. "Where are Luis and Javier now?" Miguel asked, though he suspected the answer would shatter whatever remained of Elena Morales's carefully maintained hope. Carlos's response came in a whisper that seemed to carry the weight of 6 years. They chose to stay. The well promised them everything they wanted, but the price was serving as guardians, protecting the well from those who might disturb its rest. "They're still there, Papa, still 12 years old, still hoping their service will eventually earn them the wishes they were promised." The kitchen fell silent except for the soft tick of Miguel's old clock and the distant sounds of the village awakening to another day. Dr. Vasquez set down her pen, her notes suddenly seeming inadequate to capture the magnitude of what Carlos had revealed. The boy across from her was not simply a survivor returning from an ordeal. He was a messenger carrying news that would destroy other families' ability to maintain the same desperate hope that had sustained Miguel through 6 years of searching. "How did you escape?" Miguel asked, dreading the answer but needing to understand. Carlos looked at his hands, those strangely calloused palms that Dr. Vasquez had noted during her examination. "I made a different bargain," he said. "The well's guardian offered me a choice: stay and serve like my friends, or return home with a message. But returning wasn't freedom, Papa, it was bait." The word hung in the air like a curse. Miguel's prayer beads clattered to the floor again as the implications hit him. His son's miraculous return wasn't a blessing. It was a trap designed to lure him and other desperate parents into the same web that had claimed the boys 6 years ago. "The guardian knows that parents will come looking," Carlos continued, his voice barely audible. It feeds on that love, that desperation. My return was meant to draw you into the jungle, Papa, to bring Elena, hoping to save Luis, to gather more hope, more desperation, more fuel for its ancient hunger. Dr. Vasquez felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. Carlos, why are you telling us this? Why warn us if your return was meant to lure us in? The boy's smile was heartbreaking in its sadness. Because I'm still your son, Papa. Still the boy who wanted to build you a house with electricity and hot water. The part of me that loves you is stronger than whatever hold the Guardian has on me. But that won't last forever. Each day I'm here, its influence grows stronger. Soon, I won't be able to fight it anymore. Miguel knelt beside his son's chair, taking Carlos's scarred hands in his own weathered palms. The boy's fingers felt cold despite the morning warmth, and Miguel could feel a tremor running through them that spoke of struggle happening beneath the surface. "Then we go get them," Miguel said, his voice carrying the same determination that had sustained 6 years of searching. "We go get Luis and Javier, and we find a way to break whatever hold this thing has on all of you." But Carlos shook his head, tears beginning to trace paths down his hollow cheeks. "You don't understand, Papa. The Guardian isn't just powerful, it's patient. It's been feeding on hope and desperation for centuries, maybe millennia. And now it knows we're here. It knows you'll come looking. It's already won. The jungle stretched beyond the village boundaries, no longer seeming like a natural barrier, but like a living entity watching and waiting. Miguel's 6 years of searching had been preparation for this moment, though he was only now beginning to understand the true nature of what he'd been searching for. His son had returned not as salvation but as herald, carrying news that would test every assumption about love, sacrifice, and the price of answered prayers. In the distance, Elena Morales could be seen walking toward Miguel's house, her face bright with the hope of news about her son. Behind her came other parents, other families who had lost children to the jungle over the decades, all drawn by whispers that one of the lost had finally returned home. Carlos saw them coming and closed his eyes. "It's starting, Papa. The Guardian's plan is already in motion, and I don't know if I'm strong enough to keep warning people much longer." The wooden prayer beads lay scattered on the kitchen floor, each one reflecting morning light like tiny stars. Miguel gathered them slowly, understanding for the first time that some prayers carried consequences that extended far beyond the simple act of asking. His son had returned, but the price of that return might be higher than 6 years of absence had ever cost. As Elena's footsteps approached the door, Miguel made a decision that would determine not only his family's fate, but the fate of every parent in San Marcos who had ever whispered desperate prayers into the jungle's green silence. He would go into that forest, find the stone well, and confront whatever ancient thing had been feeding on their hopes and dreams. But first, he had to find a way to protect his son from the Guardian's growing influence. Before Carlos disappeared entirely into the role he'd been sent home to play, Elena Morales burst through Miguel's door before anyone could announce her arrival, her face radiant with hope that made Miguel's heart ache. She moved like a woman half her age, energized by the first good news she'd received in 6 years. Behind her came Javier's father, Roberto Ruiz, his weathered face cautious but unable to hide the desperate optimism flickering in his eyes. "Miguel, is it true?" Elena's voice trembled with barely contained emotion. "Carlos is really home? And he knows where—" She stopped mid-sentence as she saw Carlos sitting at the kitchen table, his hollow cheeks and haunted expression transforming her joy into something more complex. "Luis, where is my Luis?" Carlos looked at his father with pleading eyes, silently begging to be released from the burden of explanation. But Miguel understood that some truths couldn't be softened, no matter how much love motivated the desire to protect. "Sit down, Elena," Miguel said gently. "Roberto, there are things Carlos needs to tell us all." The next hour passed in a haze of revelation and tears. Carlos repeated his story with mechanical precision, each detail carving deeper lines into Elena's face and bowing Roberto's shoulders under the weight of impossible choices. When Carlos finished, the kitchen felt smaller, as if the walls themselves had contracted under the pressure of so much grief and desperate hope. Elena sat motionless for several minutes, her hands folded in her lap, her teacher's mind working through implications that defied everything she understood about the world. Finally, she reached into her purse and withdrew a small wooden cross. Carved by her late husband during Luis's infancy, this was blessed by Father Rodriguez when Luis was baptized, she said, pressing the cross into Miguel's palm. If we're going into that jungle, and we are going, Miguel, make no mistake about that, then we're going with God's protection. Roberto nodded slowly, his construction worker's pragmatism warring with parental desperation. What do we need? Supplies, equipment. I have ropes, flashlights, tools from the site. Dr. Vasquez, who had remained silent during Carlos's second telling, finally spoke up. This is madness. You're talking about pursuing something that defies every law of nature, I understand. Something that has trapped 3 boys for 6 years and sent one back as... She glanced at Carlos, choosing her words carefully. As bait. But Eleanor's response carried the authority of a woman who had buried her husband and lost her only child to forces beyond her control. Doctor, with respect, you've never had children. You don't understand that some things transcend natural law. My son is alive somewhere in that jungle, and I'm going to bring him home. Miguel studied the wooden cross in his palm, feeling its weight like an anchor against the chaos threatening to overwhelm them all. The carving bore the marks of loving craftsmanship, tiny details that spoke of a father's hopes for his newborn child. Now it would carry the prayers of parents venturing into darkness to reclaim what had been taken from them. We need a plan, Miguel said, his voice steadier than he felt. The jungle has defeated every search party for 6 years. If we're going to succeed where others failed, we need to understand what we're facing. Carlos had been growing increasingly agitated as the adults discussed their expedition. Now he stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You don't understand. The Guardian doesn't just wait passively for visitors. It influences the jungle itself, creates paths that lead nowhere, sounds that draw searchers deeper into its web. And the closer you get to the well, the stronger its influence becomes. Then how did you find it originally? Roberto asked, his practical mind seeking concrete details he could work with. We had advantages we didn't understand at the time, Carlos replied, touching his chest where the thin scar marked his heart. Youth makes you resistant to certain influences. Innocence provides protection that experience dissolves. And we approached from the south, following indigenous paths that predate the Guardian's corruption of the area. Miguel spread his jungle map across the table, 6 years of careful documentation suddenly taking on new significance. Show us the route you took. Carlos studied the map for several minutes, his finger tracing paths that Miguel had marked as dead ends or impassable terrain. Here, he said finally, pointing to an area Miguel had avoided because of its reputation for claiming hunters and herb gatherers. But the paths change, Papa. What existed 6 years ago might not exist now. The jungle serves the Guardian's purposes. Elena leaned over the map, her teacher's precision evident in how she studied the terrain features and elevation markers. There are patterns here. Miguel, look at this. She traced connecting lines between various disappearances over the decades. People didn't vanish randomly. There's a progression, almost like the jungle was gradually expanding its influence. Dr. Vasquez found herself drawn into the planning despite her skepticism. Her medical training included wilderness survival, knowledge that might prove crucial if they were determined to pursue this impossible quest. If we're seriously considering this, we need proper supplies. Water purification tablets, first aid supplies, emergency food, and communication equipment, even if it's just signal flares. Roberto nodded, his contractor's mind already cataloguing resources. I can get us military-grade rope, climbing gear, high-powered flashlights. My cousin worked for the Forestry Service before he moved to the capital. He might have maps that show terrain features your civilian maps don't include. But Carlos shook his head, his expression growing more troubled. The Guardian learns from every intrusion. It adapts its defenses based on the tools people bring. Radios stop working near the well. Compasses spin wildly. Even basic equipment fails in ways that seem designed to strand visitors. Miguel felt the wooden cross warming in his palm, as if the carved wood was absorbing heat from his skin. Elena's faith in divine protection seemed naive, but after 6 years of searching had yielded nothing but heartbreak. Perhaps faith was the only tool they hadn't tried. What about spiritual protection? He asked, surprising himself with the question. Father Rodriguez performed blessings for the original search parties, but they were perfunctory, routine. What if we approach this as a spiritual battle rather than a rescue mission? Elena's face lit up with something approaching relief. Yes, the indigenous legends Luis found weren't just stories. They were warnings, instructions passed down through generations about how to confront entities that existed before Christianity arrived. Maybe the answer isn't in fighting the Guardian with modern tools, but in understanding the old ways. Dr. Vasquez looked skeptical, but Roberto was nodding slowly. My grandmother used to tell stories about places in the jungle that were forbidden, rituals that could protect travelers from things that dwelt in the deep forest. I always dismissed them as superstition, but now we have 3 boys trapped by something that shouldn't exist according to modern understanding. Miguel finished. Maybe our grandmothers knew things we've forgotten. Carlos had been listening to their planning with growing alarm. Now he moved to the window, staring out at the jungle's edge, as if expecting to see movement among the trees. The longer I stay here, the stronger the Guardian's call becomes. And every moment you spend planning, it's preparing defenses, setting traps. If you're going to do this, it has to be soon. Elena stood and walked to Carlos, placing her hands on his shoulders with the gentle authority of someone who had spent years guiding children through difficult lessons. Carlos, I need you to understand something. Your father spent 6 years refusing to give up hope. I've spent 6 years teaching other people's children while wondering if my own son was alive or dead. Roberto has worked himself half to death, trying to forget that his boy might be suffering somewhere beyond his reach. We're not planning this rescue mission because we're naive about the dangers. We're planning it because living without our children isn't actually living at all. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but his response carried a maturity that spoke of premature understanding about adult pain. Senora Elena, the Guardian feeds on exactly that kind of love. Your desperation to save Luis is precisely what it wants you to bring into its domain. Then that's what we'll bring, Elena replied simply. But we'll also bring faith, preparation, and the knowledge you've given us about what we're facing. Sometimes the only way to defeat something that feeds on your strength is to offer it more strength than it can consume. Miguel felt something shift in the room's atmosphere, as if Elena's words had introduced a possibility that hadn't existed moments before. The wooden cross in his palm seemed to pulse with warmth, and for the first time since Carlos's return, he felt something approaching hope that wasn't tainted by desperation. We leave tomorrow at dawn, Miguel announced, his decision carrying the weight of 6 years of preparation. Tonight, we gather supplies and make our peace with God. Tomorrow, we go bring our boys home. Carlos turned from the window, his face a mask of resignation and terror. The Guardian is already preparing for your arrival, Papa. It can feel the pull of your intentions, the strength of your love. But it's also ancient and patient, and has defeated everyone who challenged it for centuries. Then it's never faced parents who have had 6 years to learn the true meaning of desperate love. Elena replied, her voice carrying the quiet strength that had sustained her through years of uncertainty. It's never faced a father like Miguel, who spent 6 years mapping every path because he refused to believe his child was gone forever. As evening approached and their small planning session broke up, Miguel walked Elena and Roberto to the door. The wooden cross remained warm in his palm, as if it contained heat that belonged to some source beyond the physical world. Elena, Miguel said as she prepared to leave, are you certain about this? Once we enter that jungle, there might not be a way back. She smiled, and for a moment her face reflected the young woman who had married Luis's father with dreams of building a family in San Marcos. "Miguel, I've been dying by degrees for 6 years, teaching other people's children while wondering if my own son was trapped somewhere I couldn't reach him. If there's a chance, even a small one, that Luis is alive and can be saved, then I'd rather die trying than live wondering." After they left, Miguel sat with Carlos on the kitchen steps, both of them watching the jungle's edge as shadows lengthened toward evening. The prayer beads felt different in his hands now, less like instruments of desperate supplication and more like tools for the spiritual battle they were about to undertake. "Papa," Carlos said quietly, "I need you to know that if the Guardian's influence becomes too strong, if I start leading you toward danger instead of away from it, you might have to leave me behind." Miguel's response came without hesitation. "Carlos, I've spent 6 years learning to survive the impossible. Tomorrow, I'm going to teach that ancient thing in the jungle that it underestimated what a father's love can accomplish when it finally knows where to find its target." The jungle stretched before them, vast and patient and full of secrets. But for the first time since his son's disappearance, Miguel felt like he was moving toward answers rather than simply circling endlessly around questions that had no solutions. Tomorrow would bring dangers they couldn't fully anticipate, but it would also bring the opportunity to transform 6 years of searching into decisive action. Elena's wooden cross seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat against his palm, carrying prayers that had been whispered over Luis's cradle and would now accompany them into whatever darkness lay waiting in the forest's deepest reaches. Dawn came too quickly, and not quickly enough. Miguel had barely slept, his mind cycling through preparations and contingencies while his body fought the exhaustion of 6 years' worth of sleepless nights. The compass that had belonged to his father lay on the kitchen table beside his makeshift pack, an old brass instrument that Carlos claimed had led them to the stone well 6 years ago. But this morning, the compass needle spun lazily in endless circles, never settling on magnetic north. Miguel tapped the glass face gently, watching the needle continue its aimless dance. If Carlos was right about the Guardian's influence extending beyond the jungle's physical boundaries, then their expedition was beginning under supernatural scrutiny before they even left the village. Elena arrived as the first light painted the eastern sky pale gold. She carried a canvas bag that Roberto had provided, filled with supplies that might prove useless but represented their best attempt at preparation. Behind her came Dr. Vasquez, whose medical bag had been supplemented with wilderness survival supplies and a grim expression that suggested she'd spent the night questioning her decision to join their impossible quest. "Any change?" Elena asked, nodding toward Carlos, who sat motionless at the kitchen table, staring at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. "He's getting worse," Miguel replied quietly. "This morning he asked me who I was. For just a moment, he didn't recognize me at all." Dr. Vasquez knelt beside Carlos, checking his pulse and studying his pupils with professional concern. The boy's physical condition remained stable, but something in his expression suggested an internal struggle that was gradually being lost. His fingers traced those same unconscious patterns on the table surface, symbols that meant nothing to the adults but seemed to carry deep significance for him. "Carlos," Dr. Vasquez said gently, "can you hear me?" The boy looked up, recognition flickering in his eyes like candlelight in a strong wind. "Dr. Vasquez, you shouldn't come with us. The Guardian has been watching you through my eyes, learning about your knowledge, your skills. It's already prepared counters for everything you might try." "Then we'll have to improvise," Elena said with characteristic determination. "Roberto is meeting us at the jungle's edge with climbing equipment and emergency supplies. Father Rodriguez blessed our provisions last night, along with some items that might provide spiritual protection." Carlos shook his head slowly, his movements becoming more mechanical. "Blessings work only if the person carrying them maintains pure faith. The deeper you go into the Guardian's territory, the more it undermines your certainty about everything you believe. It feeds doubt, amplifies fear, turns your love for us into weapons against your own minds. Miguel shouldered his pack, feeling the weight of 6 years' worth of preparation condensed into essential supplies. The wooden cross Elena had given him rested against his chest, warm through his shirt. The spinning compass went into his front pocket, where he could feel its brass weight as a reminder that they were venturing beyond the boundaries of the natural world. "Then we trust in love stronger than doubt," Miguel said. "We trust that our need to bring you boys home is more powerful than whatever ancient hunger dwells in that jungle." They left San Marcos as the village was beginning its daily routines. Children walked to school with books tucked under their arms, unaware that 3 adults were departing on a mission that challenged the foundations of reality itself. Shopkeepers opened their stalls. Farmers prepared for another day of working soil that had been tended by their families for generations. Life continued with reassuring normalcy, while Miguel, Elena, and Dr. Vasquez walked toward the jungle's edge, where Roberto waited with equipment that might prove either salvation or elaborate suicide. The forest boundary looked different this morning. Trees that Miguel had studied for 6 years seemed to loom larger, their branches reaching toward each other to create a canopy that blocked more light than physics should have allowed. The familiar sounds of birds and insects were muted, as if the jungle itself was holding its breath. Roberto had arrived early, his construction workers' efficiency evident in how he'd organized their supplies. Coils of rope, battery-powered lanterns, first aid supplies, water purification tablets, emergency food rations, everything a rational person might bring to a dangerous wilderness expedition. But rationality felt increasingly inadequate as they stood at the threshold of a realm where natural laws seemed negotiable. "The compass stopped working about an hour ago," Roberto reported, showing them his own navigation instrument. Like Miguel's father's compass, the needle spun aimlessly, as if magnetic north had ceased to exist. "And listen," they paused, straining to hear what Roberto had noticed. The absence was more disturbing than any sound could have been. No bird calls, no insect chorus, no rustle of small animals moving through underbrush. The jungle had fallen silent, creating an acoustic vacuum that made their own breathing seem unnaturally loud. Carlos moved to the forest edge, his movements becoming more fluid and purposeful as they approached the Guardian's domain. "It knows we're here. It's been preparing since the moment you decided to come looking for Luis and Javier. The paths ahead will seem familiar, safe, designed to build your confidence before leading you into traps." Elena checked her bag one final time, ensuring that Luis's wooden cross remained secure against her chest. "Then we trust each other more than we trust what we see. We trust our love for our children more than we trust the evidence of our eyes." Dr. Vasquez administered a final check of their physical condition, taking pulses and blood pressure readings that would serve as baselines for monitoring the Guardian's influence on their bodies as well as their minds. Miguel's heart rate was elevated but steady. Elena's blood pressure reflected stress but not panic. Roberto's vital signs showed the controlled tension of a man accustomed to dangerous work. Only Carlos's readings gave cause for serious concern. His pulse was irregular, his blood pressure fluctuating in patterns that suggested his cardiovascular system was responding to influences beyond normal physiological stress. Most disturbing were his pupils, which dilated and contracted in rhythm with something only he could perceive. "Last chance to reconsider," Dr. Vasquez said, though her own pack was already secured, and her medical training demanded that she accompany anyone venturing into circumstances likely to produce injuries. "We've been reconsidering for 6 years," Miguel replied. "Today, we stop thinking and start acting." The first steps into the jungle felt like crossing a threshold between worlds. The temperature dropped 10 degrees within 30 feet of the tree line, despite morning sunlight that should have warmed the air. The compass in Miguel's pocket grew cold against his leg, as if the brass itself was reacting to proximity to forces that predated human understanding of navigation. Carlos moved ahead of them with increasing confidence, his familiarity with the terrain becoming more evident as they penetrated deeper into the forest. He led them along paths that seemed well established but showed no signs of recent human passage, no broken branches, no footprints, no evidence that anyone had traveled these routes in years. "This is wrong," Elena whispered, after they'd been walking for an hour. "Luis and I hiked these areas when he was younger. None of these paths existed then." Dr. Vasquez was taking notes in a small notebook, documenting temperature changes, unusual phenomena, and their own physical responses to the environment. "The paths feel ancient, like they've been here for centuries, but the vegetation suggests they were cleared recently. That's not possible according to any botany I understand." Roberto tested the ground with his construction worker's understanding of terrain stability. "The earth under these paths is compressed differently than the surrounding soil. It's as if something heavy has been traveling these routes regularly. But there are no tire tracks, no hoof prints, no signs of what might have caused the compression." Miguel felt the wooden cross warming against his chest as they moved deeper into the Guardian's domain. Elena's faith in divine protection was beginning to make sense to him, not as superstition, but as recognition that they were engaging forces that existed outside the boundaries of material reality. After 2 hours of walking, they reached a clearing that Carlos approached with visible reluctance. In the center stood a single tree, massively old, its trunk easily 20 feet in diameter. But the tree was wrong, in ways that made their eyes water to look directly at it. Its bark formed patterns that suggested symbols, its branches twisted in configurations that seemed to follow mathematical principles no human mind should be able to perceive. "This is where it begins," Carlos said, his voice carrying harmonics that hadn't been there an hour earlier. "Beyond this clearing, the jungle serves the Guardian's purposes completely. Time moves differently. Distances expand and contract based on the Guardian's whims, and everyone who enters carries the seeds of their own destruction in the form of the very love that brought them here." Elena approached the ancient tree, her teacher's curiosity overriding her growing fear. Up close, the bark patterns resolved into definite symbols, not carved but grown, as if the tree itself had been shaped by intelligence rather than nature. These looked like the markings Luis found in those missionary accounts, warnings about places that belonged to powers older than human settlement. Dr. Vasquez was checking her watch, which had stopped at the exact moment they'd entered the clearing. The hands pointed to 9:47, frozen in time, like insects trapped in amber. "Our chronometers aren't working. We have no way to measure how long we've been walking or how much time passes while we're here." But Miguel was studying Carlos, whose transformation was accelerating now that they'd entered the Guardian's core territory. The boy's eyes reflected light differently, as if illuminated by sources that existed behind his pupils rather than in the external world. His movements had acquired a precision that suggested someone else was gradually taking control of his motor functions. "How much farther to the well?" Miguel asked, though he suspected the answer would reveal how little control they actually had over their own journey. Carlos pointed deeper into the jungle, toward terrain that seemed to fold back on itself in ways that defied three-dimensional geometry. "Distance isn't measured in miles here, Papa. It's measured in choices. Every decision you make takes you either closer to your children or deeper into the Guardian's web. And the Guardian is very good at making those two destinations seem identical." Roberto secured his climbing rope to the ancient tree, creating an anchor point they could use to find their way back to this clearing, assuming the concept of back retained any meaning in a realm where natural laws were subject to supernatural revision. But even as he worked, the rope seemed to take on properties of its own, growing warm under his hands and pulsing with rhythms that matched no heartbeat he recognized. "Whatever happens from here," Eleanor said, checking her supplies one final time, "we stay together. We trust each other more than we trust what we see or hear or feel. And we remember that our children are waiting for us somewhere ahead." Carlos looked at each of them with eyes that seemed to hold depths extending far beyond his skull. "The Guardian is ready for you. It's been feeding on your hope and desperation since the moment you decided to come looking. But it's never faced parents who had 6 years to transform grief into wisdom, desperation into determination." Miguel felt the compass in his pocket growing colder as they prepared to leave the clearing and venture into terrain where the Guardian's influence would be absolute. But Elena's wooden cross continued to radiate warmth against his chest, carrying prayers that had sustained a mother's faith through 6 years of uncertainty. The jungle stretched ahead of them, promising answers and threatening destruction in equal measure. But they were no longer the same people who had lost their children 6 years ago. They were parents who had learned to survive the impossible, and they were finally within reach of the truth that had eluded them for so long. The jungle beyond the ancient tree defied every principle of geography Miguel had learned during 6 years of methodical exploration. Paths appeared where none had existed moments before, while routes they had just traveled vanished when they looked back. The canopy above them seemed to shift and breathe, allowing shafts of sunlight to penetrate in patterns that formed symbols on the forest floor, symbols that matched the carvings they'd seen on the ancient tree's bark. Carlos moved ahead of them with increasing certainty, his transformation accelerating now that they'd entered the Guardian's core domain. His gait had acquired a rhythm that suggested he was following music only he could hear, and when he spoke, his voice carried harmonics that belonged to someone or something else. "The paths are showing you what you most want to see," Carlos said, his words echoing strangely in the humid air. "Papa, you're seeing routes that lead to answers. Elena, you're seeing signs that Luis is close. Doctor, you're seeing phenomena that challenge your understanding of reality. Roberto, you're seeing problems you can solve with practical tools. But all of these perceptions are designed to lead you deeper into the Guardian's web." Elena stopped walking, her teacher's instincts recognizing a pattern that had been eluding her conscious mind. "Carlos, how do we know that anything you're telling us is true? If the Guardian sent you back as bait, how do we know your warnings aren't part of the trap?" The question hung in the humid air like a physical presence. Miguel felt the wooden cross against his chest grow warmer, as if responding to Elena's challenge with approval. She was right to question everything, including the guidance of his own son. Carlos turned to face them, and for a moment his expression held only the confusion of a 19-year-old boy who had lost 6 years of his life to forces beyond his comprehension. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "I can feel the Guardian's influence growing stronger with every step, but I can also feel the part of me that loves you fighting against it. I'm trying to warn you, but I can't promise that my warnings aren't exactly what the Guardian wants me to give you." Dr. Vasquez consulted her notebook, where she'd been documenting their physical and psychological responses to the jungle's influence. "Our vital signs are stable, but there are anomalies I can't explain." Miguel's heart rate decreases whenever Carlos warns us about dangers, as if his body trusts his son, despite his mind's skepticism. Elena's blood pressure spikes when we change direction, suggesting her maternal instincts are responding to proximity to Luis. Roberto's muscle tension increases when we encounter terrain that should require climbing equipment but somehow doesn't. Roberto was examining a tree that bore fresh scratches in its bark, marks that formed letters spelling Papa in a child's uncertain handwriting. "This is Javier's writing. I recognize it from homework I helped him with years ago. But these scratches are fresh, made within the last few hours." Miguel approached the tree, his fingers tracing the carved letters. The wood was still damp with sap, confirming Roberto's assessment that the message was recent. But Javier had been 12 years old when he disappeared. If he was still alive after 6 years in the Guardian's domain, would he still write with a child's uncertain hand? "They're leaving us messages," Elena said, her voice tight with controlled emotion. "Luis, Javier, they know we're coming. They're trying to guide us to them." But Carlos shook his head, his expression cycling between lucidity and something approaching possession. The Guardian can replicate anything: handwriting, voices, memories, even the scent of your children's hair. Every message, every sign, every indication that Luis and Javier are nearby could be fabrication designed to lead you exactly where the Guardian wants you to go. Elena pulled Luis's wooden cross from her bag, holding it up to catch a shaft of sunlight that somehow penetrated the thick canopy. Then we trust in this. We trust in faith that goes deeper than deception, love that's stronger than illusion. As if, in response to the cross's appearance, the jungle around them seemed to recoil slightly. The oppressive humidity lessened, the unnatural silence gave way to normal forest sounds, and the paths ahead became clearer and more conventionally arranged. But the change lasted only moments before the Guardian's influence reasserted itself, leaving them surrounded once again by terrain that obeyed supernatural rather than natural laws. "It works," Dr. Vasquez said, making notes about the cross's apparent effect on their environment. "Whatever that symbol represents, it has power here. The Guardian responds to it as if it represents something it can't easily counter or corrupt." Miguel felt renewed hope, but also growing concern for Carlos, whose condition was deteriorating rapidly as they moved deeper into the Guardian's territory. The boy's skin had taken on an ashen pallor. His eyes reflected light in ways that human eyes shouldn't, and his breathing had acquired a rhythm that matched the strange pulsing they could feel through the forest floor. "Carlos," Miguel said gently, "how much of yourself do you have left?" The boy's response came after a long pause, as if he was fighting to access memories that belonged to his original personality. "I can still feel love for you, Papa. I can still remember Mama's cooking, the sound of her voice when she sang me to sleep. But those memories are getting fainter, like echoes in a cave that's growing larger. Soon there won't be enough of me left to warn you about what's coming." They had been walking for what felt like hours, when they crested a small hill and saw it spread below them, a clearing unlike anything they had imagined. The space was perfectly circular, perhaps 100 yards in diameter, bounded by trees that grew in precise formation as if planted by design. In the center stood the stone well, exactly as Carlos had described it, carved from black rock that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But the well wasn't alone in the clearing. Round its perimeter sat dozens of offerings: flowers, toys, photographs, jewelry, personal items that spoke of decades' worth of desperate pilgrims who had found their way to this place. Some offerings were fresh, as if placed within days. Others had weathered to the point of near disintegration, suggesting the well had been receiving supplicants for far longer than the village legends indicated. Elena gasped and ran toward the well before anyone could stop her. Halfway across the clearing, she fell to her knees beside a small pile of items that included a child's school notebook, a wooden yo-yo, and a photograph of a woman with gentle eyes. "These are Luis's things," she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. "His notebook from 6th grade, the yo-yo his father carved for him, a picture of me from his first communion." Miguel and the others approached carefully, Roberto testing the ground with each step to ensure they weren't walking into some kind of physical trap. But the earth in the clearing felt solid, normal, as if they'd stepped from supernatural terrain back into the natural world. Dr. Vasquez knelt beside Elena, examining Luis's belongings with professional detachment that barely masked her emotional response. "These items have been here for years, but they're perfectly preserved. No weathering, no insect damage, no deterioration that should have occurred from exposure to jungle humidity." Carlos stood at the clearing's edge, unwilling or unable to approach the stone well. The Guardian preserves offerings as symbols of the bargains it has made. Every item here represents someone who made a wish, paid a price, and discovered that the cost was higher than they had imagined. Miguel approached the well itself, his father's compass finally settling into stability as he drew near the black stone structure. The needle pointed not toward magnetic north, but directly at the well's opening, as if the ancient structure had become a more powerful magnetic force than the planet's natural field. The well was perhaps 6 feet in diameter, its walls descending into darkness that seemed to extend far deeper than the water table should have allowed. The stone was covered in symbols that hurt to look at directly, not carved into the surface, but somehow grown from within the rock itself, as if the well had been shaped by intelligence rather than human tools. Roberto examined the well's construction with a contractor's eye for structural integrity. This wasn't built by any human civilization I know about. The engineering is impossible. The stones are fitted so precisely that you couldn't slide a knife blade between them, but there's no evidence of mortar or binding material. And the weight distribution suggests the structure extends much deeper underground than what we can see. Elena had gathered Luis's belongings and was clutching them against her chest, her teacher's composure finally breaking under the weight of 6 years' worth of accumulated hope and grief. He's here somewhere. I can feel him. My son is in this place, and I'm not leaving without him. But as she spoke, the well responded to her presence. The darkness within began to glow with soft phosphorescence, and sounds emerged from its depths, whispers in languages that predated human speech, mixed with voices that carried the cadences of desperate prayer. And beneath it all, faintly but unmistakably, came the sound of children singing a lullaby Elena recognized, a song she had sung to Luis every night until he'd grown too old to need such comfort. Miguel felt the wooden cross burning against his chest as the well's influence reached toward them. The Guardian was no longer hiding its presence or disguising its power. They had reached the heart of its domain, and it was ready to begin the final phase of whatever game it had been playing since Carlos's return to the village. Dr. Vasquez was taking readings with instruments that were beginning to malfunction in ways that suggested they were measuring phenomena beyond their design parameters. Electromagnetic activity is off the charts. Temperature fluctuations are creating microclimates around the well, and the acoustic properties... She paused, listening to something only she could hear through her medical equipment. There are heartbeats coming from underground. Multiple heartbeats, rhythms that match children's cardiovascular systems. Roberto secured climbing rope to the sturdiest tree he could find, preparing for the descent he suspected would be necessary. But as he worked, the rope began changing color, its practical blue nylon fading to match the black stone of the well, as if the Guardian's influence was already beginning to corrupt their equipment. Elena stood at the well's edge, Luis's wooden cross held high, her voice carrying across the clearing with absolute conviction. Luis, Javier, if you can hear me, we're here. We've come to take you home. The response came not as words, but as images reflected in the well's glowing depths, faces that might have been Luis and Javier, aged 6 years but retaining the innocence of childhood, reaching toward the surface with expressions that mixed desperate hope with profound terror. Carlos approached the well, despite his obvious reluctance. His transformation now nearly complete, but his love for his father still providing moments of clarity. Papa, this is your last chance to turn back. Once you look into that well, once you see what the Guardian is offering, you'll understand why Luis and Javier chose to stay. And you'll understand why you might make the same choice. Miguel took Elena's hand, both of them clutching wooden crosses that seemed to pulse with warmth and light in response to the well's supernatural emanations. Whatever lay ahead would test everything they believed about love, sacrifice, and the price of answered prayers. But they had come too far to turn back now, and their children were waiting somewhere in the darkness below. Elena leaned over the well's edge, her teacher's courage overriding every instinct that screamed warnings about the phosphorescent glow emanating from its depths. The images in the water became clearer as she looked directly into them, not reflections, but windows into spaces that existed beneath the jungle floor. And there, unmistakably, were Luis and Javier, but they weren't the children who had disappeared 6 years ago. These boys had aged into teenagers, their faces bearing the wisdom and weariness that belonged to adults who had seen too much. They wore clothes woven from materials that seemed to shift between cloth and shadow, and their eyes held depths that spoke of bargains made with forces beyond human comprehension. "Luis," Elena whispered, her voice carrying across whatever impossible distance separated the clearing from the underground realm where her son existed. "Mijo, I'm here. I've come to bring you home." The boy in the well's depths looked up, recognition flickering across features that retained Luis's gentle nature despite their supernatural transformation. When he spoke, his voice emerged from the well, as if he were speaking from the bottom of an ordinary water source, though the words carried harmonics that belonged to the ancient stone itself. "Mama, you shouldn't be here. The Guardian, it feeds on parental love. Your presence here gives it more power than it's had in decades." Miguel joined Elena at the well's edge, his father's compass now glowing with the same phosphorescence that illuminated the water below. In the depths, he could see not just Luis and Javier, but other figures, children and adults from decades past, all bearing the same transformed appearance that spoke of long service to whatever intelligence dwelt in this place. "Where's Carlos?" Javier asked, his voice carrying the same supernatural resonance as Luis's. "We can feel him above, but his presence is different, changed." Carlos stepped forward, his own transformation now advanced enough that he could communicate directly with the well's depths without speaking aloud. The conversation that followed occurred in harmonics that the adults could feel rather than hear, a dialogue between entities that had moved beyond purely human existence. Dr. Vasquez was documenting everything she could observe, her medical training providing framework for understanding phenomena that challenged every assumption she held about reality. The boys are physically present in an underground space, but they're also somehow existing in multiple dimensions simultaneously. Their vital signs are registering through the well's electromagnetic field. They're alive, but their biology has been fundamentally altered. Roberto tested the strength of his climbing rope, preparing for a descent that would take them beyond the boundaries of the natural world. But as he checked his equipment, he noticed that his tools were beginning to change. Metal taking on properties of stone, synthetic materials acquiring textures that matched the well's ancient construction. "The Guardian is preparing us," Roberto said, his contractor's pragmatism warring with growing acceptance of the impossible. "It's changing our equipment to match its domain, making sure we can survive in its realm long enough to understand the bargains it wants to offer." Elena clutched Luis's belongings against her chest, drawing strength from physical objects that connected her to her son's childhood innocence. "Luis, tell me how to get you out of there. Tell me what the Guardian wants, what price it demands for your freedom." The boy's image in the well's depths grew clearer, as if Elena's maternal love was strengthening the connection between their worlds. "Mama, the Guardian doesn't just want servants, it wants willing servants. It offers wishes that seem impossible, dreams that appear achievable only through supernatural intervention. But the price is always service, and service gradually transforms you until serving becomes all you remember wanting to do." Miguel felt the wooden cross burning against his chest as understanding dawned. "The Guardian feeds on hope and desperation, but it sustains itself through willing sacrifice. It needs people who choose to serve, who believe their service will eventually earn them everything they've dreamed of achieving." From the well's depths, Carlos appeared beside Luis and Javier, his transformation now complete enough that he could exist in both realms simultaneously. But traces of his original personality still flickered behind eyes that reflected depths extending far beyond his skull. "Papa, I can see what the Guardian is offering you," Carlos said, his voice carrying harmonics that resonated through the stone itself. "It's showing you visions of a life where Mama never died, where our family was wealthy enough that you never had to work yourself to exhaustion, where I grew up without the burden of worrying about your struggles." Elena saw her own visions reflected in the well's phosphorescent glow. Luis graduating from university, becoming a teacher in the capital, raising children who would never know poverty or want. The images were so vivid, so achievable seeming, that she felt her determination to rescue him wavering under the weight of possibilities that seemed within reach. "And you, Elena," Louise called from the depths, "the Guardian can show you a world where your husband never died, where you raised your children in a house with books and electricity and running water, where your son became the scholar you always knew he could be." Dr. Vasquez found herself seeing visions of medical advances that could save lives she'd been forced to watch slip away, equipment that could transform her simple village clinic into a facility capable of treating conditions that currently meant certain death in rural areas. The images were seductive in their specificity, detailed enough to seem genuinely achievable. Roberto saw his construction business expanding beyond their small region. His family lifted from poverty into prosperity that would secure his children's futures for generations. The vision showed him building schools and hospitals instead of struggling to complete simple repairs on buildings that were constantly deteriorating. But Miguel, despite the intensity of the vision surrounding him, felt the wooden cross's warmth, providing clarity that cut through the Guardian's illusions. These aren't gifts, they're temptations. The Guardian shows us what we want most desperately, then offers to make it real in exchange for service that gradually consumes who we are. Carlos nodded, his image in the well flickering between his current transformed state and echoes of the 12-year-old boy who had disappeared 6 years ago. The Guardian is ancient, patient. It understands that humans will sacrifice almost anything for their deepest desires, especially when those desires center around protecting or providing for the people they love most. Elena felt her resolve strengthening despite the seductive power of the visions surrounding her. "Then we offer it a trade it hasn't considered. We offer it something more valuable than individual service. We offer it the truth." The well's phosphorescence flickered, as if Elena's words had introduced a possibility the Guardian hadn't anticipated. Luis looked up at his mother with something approaching hope mixed with profound concern. "Mama, what do you mean?" Elena stepped back from the well's edge, her teacher's mind working through implications that reached far beyond their immediate circumstances. The Guardian feeds on hope and desperation because it keeps people isolated in their individual suffering. But what if instead of offering individual bargains, we offered collective truth? What if we revealed its existence to the entire region, warned everyone about the true price of wishes granted through supernatural intervention? Miguel understood immediately. If people knew the truth about this place, if parents knew that missing children might be trapped here rather than dead, if everyone understood that the Guardian's bargains were designed to consume rather than fulfill human desires, the Guardian would lose its primary source of power, Dr. Vasquez finished, her scientific mind recognizing the elegant solution Elena had proposed. It depends on secrecy, on people stumbling into its domain, unprepared and desperate. Knowledge is its natural enemy. Roberto was nodding, his practical understanding of human nature supporting Elena's strategy. People would still be tempted, but they'd know what they were risking. Some would choose the bargain anyway, but many would find other solutions to their problems, other ways to achieve their dreams. From the well's depths came a sound that might have been laughter, or might have been the grinding of ancient stone against itself. The Guardian's presence became more tangible, a weight pressing down on the clearing that made breathing difficult and thought sluggish. When it spoke, its voice emerged from the well, from the trees, from the stone itself, carrying harmonics that belonged to centuries of accumulated power and patience. "You think knowledge is my enemy, but knowledge is simply another form of desire. The more you understand about what I can offer, the more desperately you want access to my gifts. Your truth-telling would only bring me more supplicants, more desperate souls willing to trade eternity for temporary fulfillment." But Elena held Luis's wooden cross higher, its simple carved surface somehow radiating light that pushed back against the Guardian's oppressive presence. "Then we'll have to test that theory. We'll return to San Marcos and tell everyone what we've found here. We'll warn them about the true price of wishes, and we'll trust that human nature includes wisdom as well as desperation. Carlos's image in the well flickered more rapidly, his connection to both realms becoming unstable as the Guardian's attention focused on the adult's defiance. Papa, the Guardian isn't just offering individual bargains anymore. It's offering you a choice that affects everyone. Me, Luis, Javier, and all the others it has claimed over the decades. Miguel felt the wooden cross burning against his chest as understanding crystallized. What choice? The Guardian's voice surrounded them completely now, emerging from every surface in the clearing as its ancient patience finally gave way to direct confrontation. Join your children in willing service, and I will release enough of their original personalities to make their existence tolerable. Continue your resistance, and I will consume what remains of their humanity entirely, leaving only shadows that serve without question or memory. The ultimatum hung in the humid air like a physical presence. Elena looked at Luis's belongings in her hands, then at his transformed image in the well's depths, measuring love against wisdom and finding both insufficient for the choice they were being forced to make. But Roberto stepped forward, his climbing rope now completely transformed into something that resembled the well's black stone more than manufactured equipment. There's a third option you haven't considered, Ancient One. What if we don't choose between resistance and surrender? What if we choose something else entirely? From his bag, Roberto produced an object that made the Guardian's presence recoil noticeably. An ancient stone key carved with symbols that matched those covering the well's surface. The key pulsed with light that seemed to come from within the stone itself, and its appearance caused the phosphorescent glow from the well's depths to fluctuate wildly. Carlos brought this back from his original bargain, Roberto said, his voice carrying new authority as he held the key aloft. A tool for accessing the Guardian's power, but also, if used correctly, a way to disrupt the bonds that hold its servants in eternal slavery. The clearing fell silent, except for the sound of ancient stone grinding against itself as the Guardian's attention focused entirely on the key in Roberto's hands. For the first time since their arrival, they had introduced an element the Guardian hadn't anticipated, a possibility that existed outside the binary choice between submission and resistance. Elena felt hope rising in her chest, but also growing concern for their children, whose images in the well were becoming more unstable as the Guardian's power fluctuated. Whatever they did next would determine not only their own fates, but the fates of everyone who had been claimed by the ancient intelligence that dwelt beneath the jungle floor. The stone key pulsed with increasing intensity, its light pushing back against the well's phosphorescent glow and creating patterns of illumination that revealed hidden symbols carved into the clearing's perimeter. They were no longer just supplicants seeking bargains. They had become players in a game whose rules were finally becoming visible. The stone key in Roberto's hands pulsed with increasing intensity, its ancient carvings now glowing so brightly that they could read the symbols without looking directly at them. But as the light intensified, Carlos's image in the well began to flicker more rapidly, his connection to both realms becoming increasingly unstable. "Roberto, where did you get that?" Miguel asked, his voice tight with concern as he watched his son's form wavering between solid presence and transparent shadow. But it was Carlos himself who answered, his voice emerging from the well with harmonics that belonged entirely to the Guardian's realm. "He didn't get it from me, Papa. I never had a key. I never brought anything back from my original bargain, except the marks on my hands and the knowledge of how to find this place." Dr. Vasquez felt her medical instruments responding to the key's electromagnetic field, their readings fluctuating wildly as if measuring phenomena that existed outside normal physics. "Roberto, your vital signs are spiking in ways that suggest you're not entirely human. How long have you been carrying that key?" Roberto's expression cycled through confusion, recognition, and something approaching horror, as he stared at the pulsing stone in his palm. I found it in my tool bag this morning. I thought one of you had placed it there. Maybe something Father Rodriguez blessed along with our other supplies." Elena stepped back from Roberto, her teacher's instincts recognizing patterns that had been hidden until this moment. "You've been leading us along specific paths all day. Paths that seemed practical, safe, but always brought us exactly where we needed to be. Roberto, how did you know which routes to take through terrain you'd never explored?" The key's light intensified further, and its glow began revealing hidden truths about their entire expedition. Roberto's footprints glowed with the same phosphorescence as the well's depths. His climbing rope, which had gradually transformed from blue nylon to black stone-like material, now pulsed with the same rhythm as the key. Most disturbing, his shadow fell in directions that defied the sun's position, as if cast by light sources that existed in the Guardian's realm rather than the physical world. "Roberto," Miguel said carefully, "how long have you really been searching for Javier?" Roberto's response came after a long pause, as if he was accessing memories that belonged to someone else. 6 years, like you. Ever since the boys disappeared, I've been—" He stopped, his expression shifting as older, deeper memories surfaced. "No, that's not right. I've been searching longer than that. Much longer." Carlos's image in the well was becoming more solid as Roberto's true nature revealed itself, as if the contractor's proximity to the key was somehow strengthening the connection between realms. "Papa, Roberto isn't just Javier's father. He's been the Guardian's agent in San Marcos for decades, ensuring that desperate parents eventually found their way to this clearing." Dr. Vasquez consulted her notes, patterns she'd documented suddenly taking on sinister significance. "Roberto, you suggested this expedition. You provided the equipment. You guided us along paths that shouldn't have existed. And now you're carrying an artifact that gives you power over the Guardian's realm." She paused, her medical training providing clinical detachment that cut through emotional confusion. "You're not here to rescue your son. You're here to deliver us." Roberto stared at the key in his hand, his contractor's pragmatism warring with revelations that challenged everything he believed about his own identity. "I remember building houses in San Marcos, working construction sites, watching Javier grow up. But I also remember other things, standing in this clearing before many times, helping other parents make their final choices, guiding them to bargains they thought were salvation." Eleanor felt her wooden cross growing cold against her chest as the full scope of the deception became clear. The Guardian doesn't just influence the jungle, it influences the village itself. It places agents among us, people who seem normal but gradually guide desperate parents toward this place when the time is right. Miguel's father's compass was spinning wildly now, its needle pointing not toward magnetic north, but toward Roberto, as if the contractor had become a more powerful magnetic force than the planet's natural field. "How many, Roberto? How many families have you guided to this clearing over the years?" Roberto's memories were surfacing in fragments, decades worth of carefully orchestrated encounters with grieving parents who had lost children to the jungle's supernatural influence. Dozens, maybe more. I would appear in their lives as a helpful neighbor, someone with practical skills who could assist with search efforts. I would build their confidence, provide equipment, suggest routes that seemed logical but always led here. The Guardian's presence in the clearing intensified, its ancient voice emerging from Roberto's throat as well as from the well itself. "Roberto has served faithfully for 37 years, ensuring that I receive regular sustenance while maintaining the illusion that the disappearances are natural phenomena rather than orchestrated harvesting." Carlos was becoming more solid in the well's depths, his connection to the Guardian's realm strengthening as Roberto's true nature was revealed. "But something went wrong with our harvesting, didn't it? 3 boys at once created complications you hadn't anticipated." Roberto nodded, his own personality reasserting itself as he struggled against the Guardian's influence. "Javier was supposed to be taken alone like the others, but he insisted on bringing his friends, and the 3 of you together were more resistant to standard harvesting techniques. The Guardian had to improvise, create more elaborate scenarios to ensure your capture. Dr. Vasquez was taking notes rapidly, documenting revelations that transformed everything they thought they knew about their children's disappearance. So Carlos's return wasn't bait for individual parents. It was bait for a coordinated rescue mission that would deliver multiple adults simultaneously. Eleanor looked at Luis's belongings in her hands, understanding finally why they had been preserved so perfectly in the clearing. These weren't offerings left by Luis 6 years ago. You placed them here, Roberto, to ensure I would recognize them and believe my son was close. Everything in this clearing has been staged to maximize our emotional investment. The stone key in Roberto's palm was now pulsing so intensely that it cast shadows that moved independently of the people present. These shadows revealed the true scope of the Guardian's influence, dozens of figures standing around the clearing's perimeter, translucent forms of parents who had made this same journey over decades, all of whom had ultimately chosen to serve rather than lose their children entirely. But the Guardian made one crucial mistake, Miguel said, his voice carrying new determination as understanding crystallized. It assumed that learning the truth would make us more desperate, more willing to accept any bargain that promised to save our children. Instead, it's shown us the true scope of what we're fighting. Roberto was struggling visibly against the Guardian's influence, his own paternal love for Javier providing moments of clarity that cut through supernatural compulsion. Miguel, the key isn't just a tool for accessing the Guardian's power, it's an anchor point that maintains the boundaries between realms. If it's destroyed, the separation between the physical world and the Guardian's domain breaks down. Elena understood immediately, which would either free everyone trapped in the Guardian's realm, or allow it to expand its influence beyond the jungle into the village itself. From the well's depths, Carlos called out with urgency that belonged to his original personality rather than his transformed state. Papa, the Guardian isn't just ancient, it's weakening. The modern world, with its emphasis on scientific understanding and material explanations, has been gradually starving it of the faith-based desperation it needs for sustenance. That's why it's been more aggressive recently. Why it took 3 boys at once instead of following its traditional patterns. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her notes, her scientific mind processing implications that extended far beyond their immediate circumstances. It's an entity that feeds on supernatural belief, and belief in the supernatural has been declining as education and communication improve. The Guardian is facing extinction unless it can find new sources of power. Roberto held the key higher, its light now revealing hidden passages that led away from the clearing in all directions. Not natural paths, but tunnels carved through living rock, extending the Guardian's influence throughout the jungle and beyond. Which is why it needs willing servants who can operate in the modern world, who can guide the scientifically educated towards situations that rekindle their capacity for supernatural belief. Miguel felt the wooden cross burning against his chest as the true scope of their situation became clear. They weren't just rescuing their children. They were confronting an entity whose desperation was driving it to expand beyond its traditional boundaries, potentially threatening everyone in the region who had ever lost someone to unexplained circumstances. Elena looked at the translucent figures surrounding the clearing, recognizing in their faces the same desperate love that had brought her to this place. All of these parents chose to serve rather than lose their children forever. But service gradually consumed their original personalities until only shadows remained. The Guardian's voice emerged from multiple sources simultaneously: the well, the trees, Roberto's throat, and even the stone key itself. The choice remains the same as it has always been. Join your children in eternal service, maintaining enough of your original selves to make existence bearable, or resist and watch them fade into shadows that remember neither love nor hope, nor the families that brought them into being. But Miguel stepped forward, his father's compass now glowing with the same intensity as the stone key. and his voice carried authority that surprised everyone present, including himself. There's a third option you haven't considered, Guardian. What if we choose to end your existence entirely? The clearing fell silent, except for the sound of ancient stone grinding against itself as the Guardian's attention focused on Miguel's declaration. The phosphorescent glow from the well flickered uncertainly, as if the entity was processing a possibility it had never seriously considered. Carlos called out from the depths, his voice carrying both hope and terror. "Papa, that's not possible. The Guardian has existed for millennia. It survived the collapse of civilizations, the arrival of new religions, the transformation of the jungle from indigenous territory to colonial settlement to modern conservation area." Miguel's response surprised everyone, including himself, as he articulated understanding that seemed to come from sources beyond his conscious knowledge. But it's never faced parents who had 6 years to transform grief into wisdom, desperation into strategic thinking. It's never faced people who understood exactly what they were fighting before they entered its domain. Elena joined Miguel, her wooden cross now radiating light that pushed back against the well's phosphorescence. And it's never faced parents who were willing to sacrifice their own desires for their children's genuine freedom rather than bargaining for the illusion of family reunion. The stone key in Roberto's hand was pulsing so rapidly now that it was beginning to crack, hairline fractures appearing in its ancient surface as the Guardian's power fluctuated under pressure it had never experienced. The translucent figures around the clearing's perimeter were becoming more solid, as if the entity's weakening grip was allowing suppressed personalities to reassert themselves. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her instruments, which were registering electromagnetic phenomena beyond their measurement capacity. The Guardian's power source is destabilizing. Whatever we're doing, it's working. But the entity is preparing for a final confrontation rather than accepting defeat. The well's depths began glowing with intensified phosphorescence, and the images of Carlos, Luis, and Javier became crystal clear as the Guardian marshaled its remaining power for one last attempt to secure the willing service it desperately needed to survive the changing world that was gradually starving it of the supernatural belief that sustained its ancient hunger. The stone key in Roberto's trembling hands shattered completely, its fragments dissolving into particles of light that swirled around the clearing like luminous snow. As the ancient artifact disintegrated, the barriers between the physical world and the Guardian's realm began breaking down. The well's opening expanded, revealing not just the underground chamber where the children were held, but a vast network of tunnels that extended far beneath the jungle floor. Miguel felt his wedding ring growing warm against his finger, the simple gold band that had connected him to Maria for 13 years of marriage. Without conscious thought, he slipped it from his finger and held it toward the expanding well. "Guardian, I offer you a trade. Not service, not surrender, but a bargain you've never been offered before." Elena understood immediately, her teacher's mind recognizing the elegant logic of Miguel's proposal. She removed her own wedding ring, a simple silver band that had represented her marriage to Luis's father, and joined Miguel at the well's edge. "We offer you something more valuable than our service. We offer you our willingness to sacrifice everything we've ever wanted, including reunion with our children, to ensure their genuine freedom." The Guardian's ancient presence recoiled as if struck by physical force. From the expanding well came sounds of confusion and something approaching fear, emotions the entity hadn't experienced in millennia of confident manipulation. When it spoke, its voice carried uncertainty that transformed its words from commands into questions. "You would surrender your children permanently to ensure they escape my influence. You would accept permanent separation to guarantee their freedom." Dr. Vasquez was documenting phenomena that defied every principle of physics she understood. The well's expansion was revealing architecture that belonged to no human civilization, vast halls carved from living rock, illuminated by phosphorescent growths that pulsed with the rhythm of some massive heartbeat, filled with figures who moved with the coordinated precision of a single organism. "The Guardian isn't just an entity that feeds on desperation," she said, her scientific mind processing observations that challenged her understanding of reality. "It's a collective consciousness composed of everyone it has ever claimed. Every parent who chose service, every child who accepted eternal youth in exchange for freedom. They've all been absorbed into a single intelligence that grows, stronger with each edition." Roberto was fighting against supernatural influence that no longer needed to remain hidden. His movements were becoming more mechanical, his voice carrying harmonics that belonged to the collective consciousness rather than his individual personality. "Miguel, Elena, you don't understand the true scope of what you're challenging. The Guardian isn't just powerful, it's patient. It has waited centuries for the right combination of desperation and love to create the perfect conditions for exponential growth." Carlos appeared at the well's physical edge, no longer confined to the depths, but somehow existing in both realms simultaneously. His form flickered between his current transformed state and echoes of the 12-year-old boy who had disappeared 6 years ago. "Papa, the Guardian has been preparing for this moment since it sent me back to the village. It needed parents who were desperate enough to make ultimate sacrifices, but also wise enough to understand the true consequences of their choices." Elena felt her wooden cross burning against her chest, its simple carved surface somehow containing power that pushed back against the Guardian's expanding influence. "Then we give it what it needs, but not what it wants. We make the ultimate sacrifice, but we make it on our terms rather than accepting the Guardian's definition of what sacrifice means." Luis appeared beside Carlos, his form more solid now that the barriers between realms were breaking down. His face bore the wisdom that belonged to someone who had spent 6 years navigating supernatural politics, but his eyes still held the gentle nature Elena remembered from his childhood. "Mama, the Guardian feeds on the hope that families can be reunited, that love can overcome any obstacle. But what if you chose to love us enough to let us go completely?" Miguel understood with crystalline clarity what his son was asking. The Guardian's power depends on parents being unable to release their children, on love becoming possessive rather than liberating. But genuine love, the kind that wants the beloved's happiness, more than the lover's comfort, that's something it's never encountered. From the expanding tunnels emerged dozens of figures who had once been parents like themselves, their forms translucent, but their faces recognizable as people who had made the same journey over decades past. They moved with the mechanical precision of the collective consciousness, but traces of individual personality flickered behind eyes that still held echoes of parental love. Dr. Vasquez was taking readings that registered phenomena beyond her instrument's capacity to measure. The electromagnetic disturbance is creating a cascade effect. The Guardian's power isn't just destabilizing, it's inverting. Instead of feeding on the energy you're providing, it's being forced to expend energy to process emotions it was never designed to handle. Elena knelt at the well's edge, Luis's belongings scattered around her like offerings on an altar dedicated to letting go rather than holding on. "Luis, mijo, I need you to understand something. For 6 years, I've been teaching other people's children while believing that someday I would have my own child back to teach. But the greatest lesson I can give you now is that love sometimes means choosing what's best for the beloved, rather than what the lover wants most desperately." Javier appeared beside Luis and Carlos, his stocky frame bearing the same supernatural transformation, but retaining the optimistic nature that had characterized his childhood. "Roberto, you taught me that construction isn't just about building things. It's about creating foundations that will support whatever comes after. Maybe the foundation you've built by guiding families here all these years, was actually meant to support our freedom rather than our captivity. Roberto was struggling visibly against the collective consciousness, his individual personality reasserting itself as the Guardian's power began to fluctuate. Javier, I've spent 37 years believing I was serving your best interests, ensuring that you would never experience the poverty and struggle that defined my own childhood. But I've been serving an entity that kept you trapped in childhood forever, unable to grow into the man you were meant to become. The well's expansion revealed the true scope of the Guardian's domain, not just underground chambers, but an entire realm that existed parallel to the physical world, connected by points of supernatural significance throughout the jungle. Hundreds of figures moved through this realm, all bearing the same transformed appearance, all serving the collective consciousness that had been growing stronger for millennia. Miguel felt his father's compass glowing with heat that burned his palm, but he maintained his grip as understanding dawned. The Guardian isn't just ancient, it's dying. The modern world, with its emphasis on scientific explanation and material solutions, has been gradually starving it of the supernatural belief it needs for sustenance. It's been harvesting families more aggressively because it's fighting extinction. Carlos nodded, his connection to both realms allowing him to perceive the Guardian's true condition. But extinction doesn't just mean the Guardian's death. It means the release of everyone it has ever absorbed. All the parents who chose service, all the children who accepted eternal youth, everyone who became part of the collective consciousness. They would all be freed if the Guardian's power was completely severed. Elena stood, her wooden cross now radiating light that illuminated hidden symbols carved into the clearing's perimeter. Not warnings about the Guardian's power, but instructions for those brave enough to confront it. Then that's what we choose. Not bargains, not service, not even reunion with our children. We choose their complete freedom, even if it means permanent separation. Dr. Vasquez looked up from her instruments, which were beginning to smoke as they tried to measure electromagnetic phenomena that exceeded their design parameters. The cascade effect is accelerating. The Guardian's power source is collapsing under pressure from emotions it can't process or absorb. But the collapse is going to be violent. We need to prepare for physical as well as supernatural disruption. Roberto had broken free from the collective consciousness enough to access equipment he'd hidden around the clearing during previous visits, not tools for capturing families, but explosives designed to destabilize the underground chambers if the Guardian ever became too dangerous to contain. I've been preparing for this moment for decades, even while serving the entity I was meant to destroy. The charges are positioned to collapse the tunnel network, but the explosion will seal this realm permanently. Miguel took Elena's hand, both of them holding wooden crosses that seemed to pulse with heartbeats, matching their own. Then we make our choice knowing the consequences. We love our children enough to ensure their complete freedom, even if that freedom exists in a realm we can never enter. The Guardian's voice emerged from every surface in the clearing, carrying desperation that belonged to an intelligence facing extinction for the first time in its ancient existence. You don't understand what you're choosing. Complete severance means your children will be free, but they will also be forever beyond your reach. No reunion, no contact, no knowledge of whether they achieve happiness in the realm where they will exist. You will spend the rest of your lives wondering if you made the right choice. Eleanor's response came without hesitation. That's what genuine love means, Guardian. Choosing your child's welfare over your own desires, accepting uncertainty about their happiness rather than demanding control over their circumstances. Miguel felt his wedding ring burning in his palm as he prepared to make the ultimate offering. Maria taught me that love isn't about possession. It's about creating space for the beloved to become whoever they're meant to be. I've spent 6 years learning to love Carlos enough to let him go. Now I choose to love him enough to set him completely free. The well's phosphorescence began to fluctuate wildly as the Guardian's power destabilized under pressure from emotions it had never been designed to process. Throughout the underground realm, the collective consciousness was fragmenting as individual personalities reasserted themselves for the first time in decades or centuries. Carlos, Luis, and Javier stood at the boundary between realms, their forms becoming more solid as the Guardian's grip on them weakened. But their expressions held the wisdom of young people who understood that freedom might mean separation from everyone they loved most. "Papa," Carlos said, his voice carrying the strength of his original personality despite the supernatural harmonics that still influenced his speech. "Are you certain this is what you want? We might find happiness in whatever realm exists beyond the Guardian's influence, but you'll never know for sure. You'll have to live with uncertainty for the rest of your lives." Miguel smiled, the expression carrying 6 years' worth of accumulated love and wisdom. "Carlos, the greatest gift parents can give their children is the freedom to write their own stories, even if those stories unfold beyond the parents' ability to witness them. Your mother taught me that before she died, and I've been learning to practice it ever since you disappeared." Selena added her silver wedding ring to Miguel's gold band, both of them glowing with heat that seemed to come from sources beyond physical combustion. "Luis, mijo, I've spent 6 years teaching other people's children while hoping to have my own child back to guide and protect. But the most important lesson I can give you is that love sometimes means stepping back so the beloved can step forward into whatever future they're meant to inhabit." The Guardian's ancient presence was becoming increasingly frantic as it felt its power source collapsing under the weight of emotions it couldn't absorb or control. The collective consciousness was fragmenting, individual personalities emerging from centuries of suppressed existence, all of them looking toward the parents who had chosen freedom over reunion. Roberto activated the charges he'd placed around the clearing's perimeter, explosives designed to collapse the tunnel network and seal the Guardian's realm permanently. 30 seconds until detonation. If we're going to do this, we need to commit completely. No hesitation, no looking back, no regret about choices that can't be unmade. The boys stood ready at the threshold between worlds, their forms becoming more luminous as the Guardian's influence weakened. They looked at their parents with expressions that mixed gratitude, love, and the kind of mature understanding that comes only from witnessing ultimate sacrifice offered without expectation of reward. Miguel and Elena threw their wedding rings into the well's glowing depths, the metal disappearing into phosphorescence that began contracting rather than expanding as the Guardian's power collapsed inward upon itself. "We love you enough to let you go completely," Elena called to the boys as explosive charges began detonating around the clearing's perimeter. "Find happiness in whatever realm awaits you, and know that you carry our love with you wherever you go." The last thing Miguel saw before the underground chambers collapsed was Carlos waving goodbye, his face radiant with freedom that belonged entirely to himself. For the first time since his childhood had been interrupted by supernatural forces beyond his control, the explosions began as distant rumbles that seemed to emerge from deep within the earth itself, growing stronger as Roberto's carefully placed charges detonated in sequence around the clearing's perimeter. The stone well collapsed inward with a sound like the world breaking, its ancient black stones grinding against each other as centuries of accumulated power imploded into nothingness. Miguel felt the ground shaking beneath his feet, but his attention remained fixed on the collapsing gateway where Carlos had been standing moments before. The phosphorescent glow that had illuminated his son's face was fading rapidly, leaving only memories of a wave goodbye and the profound peace that had radiated from someone finally experiencing complete freedom. Elena clutched Luis's belongings against her chest as the clearing transformed around them. The perfect circle that had contained the stone well was cracking along geometric lines, revealing that the entire space had been artificially constructed rather than naturally formed. Beneath the surface lay the true jungle floor, organic, chaotic, alive with the sounds of insects and birds that had been absent during their supernatural encounter. Dr. Vasquez was documenting the collapse with instruments that were finally registering phenomena within their normal parameters. The electromagnetic disturbance is dissipating rapidly. Temperature readings are returning to normal jungle ranges. Whatever power source maintained this place has been completely severed, but Roberto was staring at his hands, which no longer bore the calluses from the stone key's influence. His memories were reorganizing themselves, decades of supernatural compulsion falling away to reveal the man he had been before the Guardian's influence transformed him into an unwilling harvester of desperate families. "I remember now," Roberto said, his voice carrying wonder mixed with horror. 37 years ago, I was the desperate parent. Javier's older brother, Manuel, disappeared in this jungle when Javier was just a baby. I found this place the same way you did, following legends, carrying hope, willing to make any bargain to bring my child home. The clearing continued to collapse around them, but the destruction was contained within the supernatural boundaries that were dissolving rather than expanding outward. Ancient stone structures crumbled into dust that was immediately absorbed by jungle vegetation, as if the forest itself was reclaiming territory that had been held under supernatural dominion for centuries. Elena felt her wooden cross growing cool against her chest, its earlier burning intensity fading to the normal temperature of carved wood blessed by village faith rather than supernatural fire. "Roberto, what happened to Manuel? Did you find him in the Guardian's realm?" Roberto's eyes filled with tears as suppressed memories surfaced, revealing truths he had been prevented from acknowledging for nearly 4 decades. "I made the same choice you just made. I chose his freedom over reunion. But the Guardian was stronger then, still growing rather than weakening. My sacrifice freed Manuel, but it also bound me to serve in his place, ensuring other families would face the same impossible choice." Miguel helped Dr. Vasquez gather her equipment as the ground continued to shift beneath them. Her instruments were recording the return of normal jungle conditions, but also documenting residual effects that would take time to fully understand. The electromagnetic field is stabilizing, but there are still anomalies that suggest the barrier between realms was permanently altered rather than simply restored. The translucent figures that had surrounded the clearing's perimeter were fading like morning mist, their forms becoming less distinct as the collective consciousness that had sustained them for decades or centuries finally released its hold. Some waved goodbye before disappearing, their individual personalities asserting themselves one final time before passing into whatever realm awaited beyond the Guardian's influence. Elena looked at Luis's school notebook, his wooden yo-yo, the photograph of herself from his first communion. These objects no longer held the supernatural preservation that had kept them perfect despite years of jungle humidity. They were aging rapidly, showing the wear and deterioration that should have occurred naturally, transforming from supernatural artifacts into ordinary mementos of a childhood that had ended 6 years ago. "They're really gone," Eleanor whispered, though her voice carried acceptance rather than despair. "Our children are free, but they're also beyond our ability to contact or comfort or protect." Miguel felt his father's compass cooling in his pocket, its needle finally pointing toward true magnetic north instead of supernatural destinations. The brass instrument that had guided 3 generations through literal and metaphorical journeys was once again simply a tool for navigation rather than a conduit for otherworldly influences. "But we chose correctly," Miguel said, his voice carrying the quiet strength that comes from making difficult decisions based on love rather than need. Carlos waved goodbye with genuine joy on his face, not the artificial happiness the Guardian provided, but real contentment that belonged entirely to himself. The jungle sounds that had been absent during their supernatural encounter were returning gradually. Bird calls, insect chorus, the rustle of small animals moving through underbrush. The forest was reclaiming its natural rhythms as the Guardian's influence dissipated completely. leaving behind an ecosystem that functioned according to biological rather than supernatural principles. Dr. Vasquez was checking their vital signs, documenting the physical effects of their encounter with forces that had challenged every assumption she held about reality. Your stress levels are decreasing rapidly, despite the traumatic nature of what we've just experienced. It's as if your bodies are responding to the resolution of tensions that have been building for years. Roberto was gathering his equipment, but the tools that had been transformed by the Guardian's influence were returning to their original states, metal becoming metal rather than stone, synthetic materials resuming their manufactured properties, practical items serving practical purposes instead of supernatural functions. We need to leave this area before the structural collapse extends beyond the clearing, Roberto said, his contractor's expertise returning as supernatural compulsion faded. The underground chambers were extensive, and their collapse could destabilize large sections of jungle floor. As they prepared to depart, Elena took one final look at the space where the stone well had stood. Nothing remained except a depression in the earth that was already beginning to fill with jungle vegetation. Within months, there would be no visible sign that anything supernatural had ever existed in this place. Will other people find their way here? Eleanor asked, her teacher's mind already working through implications that extended beyond their immediate experience. Will other desperate parents follow the same legends that brought us to this place? Miguel felt the wooden cross warming slightly against his chest, not with supernatural fire, but with the gentle heat that comes from faith maintained despite uncertainty. The legends will persist, but the power behind them is gone. Parents might still search, but they'll find only normal jungle, difficult and dangerous, but governed by natural rather than supernatural laws. Dr. Vasquez was making final notes about phenomena that had challenged her scientific understanding, but ultimately yielded to logical analysis. The Guardian was real, but it was also finite, ancient and powerful, but dependent on external energy sources that were gradually being depleted by changes in human culture and belief systems. Roberto led them away from the collapsing clearing, his knowledge of jungle navigation now serving rescue rather than capture. But his steps carried the weight of someone who understood that freedom from supernatural compulsion meant accepting responsibility for decades of actions he had been unable to control. Miguel, Elena, Roberto said as they walked toward the village, I need you to know that every family I guided to this clearing faced the same choice you faced. Most chose service over separation. I tried to warn them when I could, but the Guardian's influence made resistance almost impossible. Elena's response came without hesitation. Roberto, you were a victim too. The Guardian needed agents who appeared trustworthy because they genuinely cared about helping parents find their children. Your love for Manuel was real, and it sustained you through decades of unwilling service. The walk back to San Marcos took several hours, but it felt shorter than their journey into the jungle's supernatural depths. The paths they followed were ordinary trails created by hunters and herb gatherers, routes that obeyed normal principles of geography rather than serving otherworldly purposes. Miguel felt his prayer beads warming in his hand, not with supernatural fire, but with the comfort that comes from faith sustained through ultimate testing. Maria's memory felt closer now, not because supernatural forces were manipulating his perceptions, but because his grief had finally transformed into something that honored her love rather than being consumed by its absence. As the village came into sight, Elena felt Luis's belongings settling into their proper weight and texture, ordinary objects that had belonged to an extraordinary child, mementos that would help her remember his laughter rather than focus on his absence. She was still a teacher who had lost her son, but she was also a teacher who had loved him enough to set him free. Dr. Vasquez was already planning how to document their experience in ways that would serve medical science without sensationalizing phenomena that most people would dismiss as impossible. The Guardian had been real, but it was also gone. And the greater service lay in understanding how human psychology responds to extreme circumstances, rather than proving supernatural entities exist. Roberto would return to his construction work, but with the knowledge that he had finally broken free from influences that had controlled him for nearly 4 decades. Javier and Manuel were both free now, existing in whatever realm awaited beyond the Guardian's collapsed domain. And Roberto could spend his remaining years serving his community's practical needs, rather than supernatural harvesting. As they approached San Marcos, Miguel realized that his 6 years of searching had prepared him not just to find Carlos, but to make the choice that would free him. The prayer beads, the jungle maps, the methodical exploration, all of it had been leading toward a moment when love had to choose freedom over possession, when parents had to demonstrate that genuine care meant accepting separation rather than demanding reunion. The village waited ahead of them, filled with people who would never fully understand what had transpired in the jungle's depths. But understanding wasn't necessary. What mattered was that 3 more families had learned the true meaning of love, and that 3 young people were finally free to write their own stories in whatever realm their freedom had opened to them. Father Rodriguez was waiting at the village edge when they emerged from the jungle, his expression carrying the careful mixture of hope and concern that belonged to someone who had spent years ministering to families devastated by unexplained losses. He had been praying since dawn, he explained, responding to spiritual urgency he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Miguel, Elena, he said gently, studying their faces for signs of the answers they had sought. Did you find them? Are the boys? Elena's response came with surprising peace, her teacher's composure intact despite the magnitude of what they had experienced. We found them, Father, and we set them free. The priest's understanding went deeper than his words revealed. He had ministered to too many grieving families over the years, had heard too many stories about the jungle claiming children who ventured too far from the village boundaries. His faith had always suggested that some disappearances carried spiritual rather than merely physical significance. Free means they're beyond our ability to contact them, doesn't it? Father Rodriguez asked, his question carrying the wisdom of someone who understood that divine mystery often demanded human acceptance rather than explanation. Miguel nodded, feeling his prayer beads settling into their familiar weight, not lighter because his burden had been lifted, but different because his grief had been transformed into something that honored Carlos's memory rather than being consumed by his absence. Carlos waved goodbye with genuine joy, Father. Not the artificial happiness of someone accepting consolation, but real contentment that belonged entirely to himself. Dr. Vasquez was documenting their physical condition as they returned to normal village life. Their vital signs reflected exhaustion and emotional processing, but also the kind of deep relaxation that comes from resolving tensions that have been building for years. Whatever we experienced in that jungle, it provided closure rather than additional trauma. Roberto gathered his tools, equipment that had been transformed by supernatural influence, but was now simply practical instruments for construction work. His memories were still reorganizing themselves, decades of supernatural compulsion giving way to clarity about his own choices and motivations. Father, Roberto said, I need to confess something that goes back nearly 40 years. My service to this community hasn't always been as voluntary as it appeared. The priest listened as Roberto explained his decades of supernatural compulsion, his unwilling role in guiding desperate families toward the Guardian's domain, and his ultimate participation in the entity's destruction. Father Rodriguez's responses carried pastoral wisdom rather than judgment, understanding that confession served healing rather than condemnation. Roberto, you were instrument of God's plan even when you believed you were serving darker purposes, the priest said. Your love for your sons, both Manuel and Javier, sustained you through decades of unwilling service and ultimately enabled their freedom. Elena looked at Luis's belongings. which had returned to their natural state as ordinary objects that had belonged to an extraordinary child. The school notebook showed normal wear. The wooden yo-yo bore the scuff marks that would have accumulated from childhood play, and her photograph had aged in ways that spoke of time passing rather than supernatural preservation. Father, how do we help other families understand what happened here? How do we serve parents who might still come looking for children who disappeared in ways that seem impossible to explain? Father Rodriguez considered her question with the thoughtfulness of someone who understood that spiritual truth often required practical application. We tell them the truth, Elena. We explain that love sometimes means choosing what's best for the beloved, rather than what the lover wants most, desperately. And we trust that genuine faith can sustain people through uncertainty about outcomes they can't control. Miguel felt his father's compass settling into normal function in his pocket, its needle pointing toward magnetic north rather than supernatural destinations. The brass instrument would continue to guide him through literal journeys, but its deeper service had been providing direction during the most difficult navigation of his life, learning to love his son, enough to let him go completely. The village was beginning its evening routines, as they walked through streets that seemed both familiar and subtly changed. Children played in yards where their own children had once run and laughed. But the sight brought comfort rather than pain, because Miguel, Elena, and Roberto now carried the knowledge that Carlos, Luis, and Javier existed somewhere beyond physical boundaries, free to pursue whatever happiness their new realm offered. Dr. Vasquez was already planning how to serve other families who might face similar circumstances, other parents who might encounter forces that challenged scientific understanding. Her medical training provided framework for helping people process experiences that existed at the boundaries of the explainable. And her recent encounter had taught her that healing sometimes required acceptance rather than cure. "We document what we experienced," she said. "Not to prove supernatural entities exist, but to help other people understand how human psychology responds to extreme circumstances. The guardian was real, but it's gone. What remains is our responsibility to help families process loss in ways that honor love rather than being consumed by it." Elena returned to her small house, where Luis's bedroom remained exactly as he had left it 6 years ago. But instead of shrine to frozen childhood, the room could now become memorial to growth and potential that continued in realms beyond her ability to witness. She began gathering his clothes and toys, not to dispose of them, but to transform them into gifts for other children who needed reminders that they were loved. Miguel sat on his kitchen steps as evening approached, working his prayer beads between his fingers while watching the jungle's edge. The forest no longer seemed like a malevolent presence that had swallowed his world, but like a natural barrier that had ultimately served divine purposes he was only beginning to understand. Roberto returned to his construction work, but with renewed understanding of his service to the community. Houses he built would shelter families. Roads he maintained would connect people rather than leading them towards supernatural entrapment. And his practical skills would serve life rather than otherworldly harvesting. Father Rodriguez prepared his evening service with additional prayers for children who existed beyond normal boundaries, not prayers requesting their return, but prayers celebrating their freedom and asking for wisdom to help their families find peace in uncertainty. His faith had always suggested that divine love sometimes demanded human letting go rather than holding on. As night fell over San Marcos, the village settled into rhythms that had been subtly changed by events most residents would never fully understand. 3 families had learned the true meaning of love. 3 young people had achieved freedom that transcended physical existence. And an ancient entity that had fed on desperation for millennia had finally encountered emotions it couldn't absorb or control. Miguel felt Maria's presence more strongly than he had since her death, not because supernatural forces were manipulating his perceptions, but because his grief had finally transformed into something that honored her love rather than being defined by her absence. She had taught him that love meant creating space for the beloved to become whoever they were meant to be. And he had spent 6 years learning to practice that wisdom. Elena graded papers from her students, but with renewed understanding of her calling as teacher. Every child she guided toward knowledge and wisdom carried potential that might unfold in ways she would never witness. And her service lay in providing foundation rather than controlling outcomes. Dr. Vasquez updated her medical records to document treatments that had served healing rather than cure, interventions that had helped people process mystery rather than demanding explanation for everything they experienced. Her scientific training now included appreciation for phenomena that existed at boundaries of the measurable. Roberto repaired buildings that sheltered families, constructed foundations that would support whatever structures future generations chose to build, and maintained roads that connected people to each other rather than leading them toward supernatural entrapment. The jungle stretched beyond the village boundaries, no longer harboring ancient intelligences that fed on human desperation, but simply serving as natural barrier between civilization and wilderness. Children could once again play at its edges without supernatural danger, though normal cautions about natural hazards remained appropriate. In whatever realm existed beyond the Guardian's collapsed domain, Carlos, Luis, and Javier were free to write their own stories, pursue their own dreams, and become whoever they were meant to be without supernatural influence or parental limitation. They carried their family's love with them, but as gift rather than burden, blessing rather than obligation. Miguel's prayer beads caught evening light as he worked them between his fingers, each worn wooden sphere containing years of desperate supplication that had finally been transformed into grateful acceptance. His prayers now asked not for impossible reunions, but for wisdom to honor love through letting go rather than holding on. Elena's wooden cross rested against her chest with normal weight and temperature, no longer burning with supernatural fire, but carrying the gentle warmth that comes from faith sustained through ultimate testing. Luis existed beyond her ability to protect or guide, but also beyond any force's ability to harm or control. The village children played in streets where Carlos, Luis, and Javier had once run and laughed, their voices carrying the same joy and potential that had characterized the boys who had been claimed by forces beyond human understanding. Life continued with reassuring normalcy, but also with deeper appreciation for the mystery and wonder that existed at the boundaries of the explicable. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Miguel understood that his 6 years of searching had prepared him not just to find Carlos, but to make the choice that would free him. Every mapped trail, every documented failure, every night spent praying at the jungle's edge had been leading toward a moment when love had to choose freedom over possession. The Guardian was gone, but its defeat had required parents who loved their children enough to sacrifice reunion for freedom, who chose uncertainty about their beloved's happiness rather than demanding control over their circumstances. That kind of love, Miguel realized, was stronger than any supernatural force because it served the beloved's welfare rather than the lover's needs. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families who needed support in processing losses that might never be fully explained. New opportunities to demonstrate that genuine love sometimes requires the courage to let go completely. But tonight, 3 parents rested in the knowledge that they had chosen correctly, and 3 young people existed somewhere beyond their reach, but finally completely free. 1 year later, Miguel Santos sat on his kitchen steps in the gentle light of dawn, working his prayer beads between weathered fingers that had learned to find peace rather than searching for miracles. The wooden spheres, worn smooth by countless hours of desperate supplication, now carried the weight of grateful acceptance rather than pleading desperation. The village of San Marcos had settled into rhythms that subtly honored the transformation that had occurred in its midst. Children still played at the jungle's edge, but with natural caution rather than supernatural fear. Parents still worried when their little ones wandered too far from home, but their concerns focused on ordinary dangers rather than ancient entities that fed on family bonds. Elena Morales walked past Miguel's house each morning on her way to the village school, her canvas bag filled with lesson plans that reflected renewed understanding of her calling as teacher. She had learned that education meant providing foundation rather than controlling outcomes, nurturing potential that might unfold in ways she would never witness. Her students sensed something different about their teacher, a depth of wisdom that came from loving someone enough to let them go completely. Luis's bedroom had been transformed from frozen shrine to living memorial. His clothes had become gifts for other children. His books had found their way to students who needed reminders that learning opened doorways to possibilities beyond immediate circumstances. The wooden yo-yo his father had carved still sat on the windowsill, no longer preserved by supernatural forces but maintained by Elena's care as reminder of childhood joy that continued in realms beyond her ability to witness. Dr. Carmen Vasquez had documented their jungle experience in medical terms that served healing rather than sensation. Her reports described human psychology's response to extreme circumstances, the way grief could transform into wisdom when love chose service over possession. Other physicians consulted her notes when treating families who had lost children to unexplained disappearances, learning to provide support that honored mystery, rather than demanding impossible explanations. Her clinic had become a place where families could process losses that existed at the boundaries of the explainable. Dr. Vasquez offered practical medical care alongside emotional support that acknowledged the reality of experiences that challenged scientific understanding. She had learned that healing sometimes required acceptance rather than cure, wisdom rather than explanation. Roberto Ruiz had returned to his construction work with renewed appreciation for building foundations that would support whatever structures future generations chose to create. His tools served practical purposes rather than supernatural harvesting. His roads connected families rather than leading them toward ancient traps. The village children who played in parks he had helped construct carried the same joy and potential that had once belonged to Javier. And Roberto found comfort in serving life rather than otherworldly forces. Father Rodriguez had integrated their experience into pastoral wisdom that served his entire congregation. His sermons explored the spiritual courage required to love someone enough to let them go completely, the faith necessary to choose the beloved's welfare over the lover's comfort. Families facing various forms of loss found guidance in understanding that genuine love sometimes demanded releasing, control rather than tightening grip. The jungle stretched beyond San Marcos with natural rather than supernatural mystery. Botanists and zoologists occasionally visited to study ecosystems that functioned according to biological principles, finding species diversity and ecological interactions that science could document and understand. The forest had reclaimed its role as natural barrier rather than supernatural hunting ground. Miguel had received visitors over the past year, other parents whose children had disappeared in circumstances that defied easy explanation, families seeking guidance from someone who had faced the ultimate test of parental love. He shared his story carefully, emphasizing the importance of loving children enough to choose their freedom over reunion, the wisdom of accepting uncertainty rather than demanding impossible answers. The hardest lesson, Miguel would tell them, his prayer beads catching morning light between his fingers, is learning that love sometimes means stepping back so the beloved can step forward. Carlos waved goodbye with genuine joy on his face, not because he was leaving us, but because he was finally free to become whoever he was meant to be. Elena had established correspondence with teachers in other regions, sharing educational approaches that honored mystery while providing practical knowledge. Her students learned to appreciate questions that couldn't be answered as well as problems that could be solved. developing intellectual courage that would serve them when they encountered their own experiences at the boundaries of the explainable. The village had grown slightly over the past year, welcoming families who appreciated a community that balanced practical concerns with spiritual wisdom. New residents often commented on the unusual peace that seemed to characterize San Marcos. The way neighbors supported each other through difficulties while maintaining respect for experiences that couldn't be fully shared. Miguel's small adobe house had been repaired and expanded, but modestly. He had learned that contentment came not from material comfort, but from aligning choices with deeper values. Carlos's bedroom remained as it had been, not as shrine, but as reminder of growth and potential that continued in dimensions beyond physical observation. Dr. Vasquez had trained 2 younger physicians to serve remote villages, passing along medical knowledge enhanced by understanding that healing involved treating the whole person rather than just physical symptoms. Her students learned to provide care that honored the mystery inherent in human experience, while offering practical interventions based on scientific understanding. Roberto had taken apprentices from among the village youth, teaching construction skills that emphasize service to community rather than individual profit. His students learned that building meant creating structures that would shelter and support families for generations. Work that honored both practical necessity and deeper purpose. On special occasions, Carlos's birthday, the anniversary of their jungle expedition, moments when the village gathered to celebrate life's continuity, Miguel, Elena, and Roberto would share quiet acknowledgement of the choice they had made and the freedom they had chosen for their children. These conversations carried gratitude rather than grief, wisdom rather than regret. "Sometimes I wonder what they're doing now," Elena might say, her wooden cross warm against her chest. "Whether Luis is still teaching, whether he's found happiness in whatever realm their freedom opened to them." "I choose to believe they're thriving," Miguel would respond, his father's compass pointing steady and true in his pocket. Love that chooses freedom over possession creates space for the beloved to flourish in ways we might never have imagined. Roberto would add his own perspective, shaped by decades of unwilling service, followed by redemptive choice. They carry our love with them, but as gift rather than burden. That's the greatest blessing parents can offer their children, love that supports rather than constrains, that celebrates their potential rather than demanding specific outcomes. The jungle's edge no longer seemed like boundary between safety and danger, but like natural transition between different forms of mystery. Village children played games that carried echoes of Carlos, Luis, and Javier's childhood adventures, their laughter testament to life's continuity and joy's persistence despite loss and change. Father Rodriguez had performed marriage ceremonies, baptisms, and funeral services that reflected deeper understanding of love's true nature. His ministry emphasized that spiritual growth often required releasing control rather than tightening grip, choosing faith over fear, accepting mystery as invitation to trust rather than demand for explanation. As the first anniversary of their jungle expedition approached, Miguel found himself returning to the forest edge at dawn, not to search or call out names, but to offer prayers of thanksgiving for wisdom gained through ultimate testing. His petition no longer asked for impossible reunions, but expressed gratitude for love that had proven stronger than supernatural manipulation. Elena joined him some mornings, her teacher's wisdom expanded by understanding that the most important lessons often couldn't be conveyed through direct instruction, but had to be discovered through lived experience. They would stand together in comfortable silence, 2 parents who had learned that genuine love sometimes required the courage to let go completely. Dr. Vasquez documented the long-term effects of their experience, noting that trauma could transform into wisdom when processed through communities that provided support without demanding explanation. Her research contributed to understanding how families could heal from losses that challenged conventional frameworks for grief and recovery, the village photograph that hung in the town. All now included families who had arrived over the past year, drawn by stories of a community that balanced practical concerns with spiritual depth. San Marcos had become a place where people could process mystery while maintaining connection to ordinary life, where extraordinary experiences were honored rather than dismissed or sensationalized. Roberto's construction projects reflected architectural principles that emphasized sustainability and community benefit over individual luxury. Buildings he designed served families for generations rather than requiring constant maintenance. Roads he built connected people rather than leading them toward isolation or danger. Miguel's prayer beads had become focus for meditation that expressed gratitude rather than supplication, acknowledgement of blessings received rather than requests for impossible interventions. Each worn wooden sphere contained accumulated wisdom about love's true nature, lessons learned through testing that had ultimately led to liberation rather than loss. On quiet evenings, when the village settled into peaceful routines and the jungle whispered with natural rather than supernatural mystery, Miguel would sit on his kitchen steps and feel Maria's presence more strongly than he had since her death. Not because otherworldly forces were manipulating his perceptions, but because his grief had finally transformed into something that honored her love rather than being defined by her absence. Elena would grade papers from students who carried potential that might unfold in ways she would never witness, finding joy in providing foundation rather than controlling outcomes. Her classroom had become a place where children learned to appreciate questions as well as answers, mystery as well as certainty, the beauty of growth that continued beyond any individual's ability to guide or constrain. The jungle stretched toward horizons that held natural wonder rather than supernatural threat. Ecosystems that functioned according to principles science could study and appreciate. Somewhere beyond physical boundaries, Carlos, Luis, and Javier existed in whatever realm their freedom had opened to them, carrying their family's love as blessing rather than burden. Miguel worked his prayer beads between weathered fingers, each sphere containing years of accumulated faith that had been tested and refined through ultimate choosing. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to demonstrate that genuine love sometimes required the courage to let go completely. New chances to serve other families facing losses that challenged conventional understanding. But tonight, 3 parents rested in knowledge that they had chosen correctly, that their children existed somewhere beyond their reach but finally completely free. The wooden cross Elena carried had returned to normal weight and temperature. Roberto's tools served practical purposes rather than supernatural compulsion. Miguel's compass pointed toward true north, and his prayer beads carried gratitude for love that had proven stronger than any ancient force in whatever realm existed beyond the Guardian's collapsed domain. 3 young people wrote their own stories, pursued their own dreams, and became whoever they were meant to be. They carried their family's love with them, but as gift rather than obligation, freedom rather than constraint, blessing that supported their happiness rather than demanding their presence. The village of San Marcos slept peacefully under stars that witnessed both mystery and wonder, both loss and liberation, both the pain of letting go and the profound joy that comes from love finally learning its truest expression.